Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. Now let's begin. I had just settled in for the night, a typical late evening in my small New York City apartment. I was tired, ready to relax after a long day at work. The city noises outside were the usual sirens, distant chatter, and the hum of traffic. I was used to it. It was comforting in a way, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this massive city. Around 11:30 p.m., my phone rang. The number was unknown, and I usually don't pick up unknown calls, but something in me just decided to answer. On the other end was a man, his voice shaky and breathless. He kept saying, they're coming. You have to get out." It startled me, but I assumed it was a prank or someone who dialed the wrong number. I told him he had the wrong person, and hung up. I went back to my routine, brushing it off, but about 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same number. I hesitated before answering, and the same man's voice was on the other end. This time he was more frantic, almost shouting, "Listen to me. They're coming for you. Get out now." I could hear heavy breathing, like he was running or hiding. It gave me chills, but I still thought it was some twisted joke. I hung up again, feeling a bit more uneasy. I tried to focus on something else, turning on the TV to distract myself, but the tension wouldn't go away. My eyes kept darting to the phone, half expecting it to ring again. And it did. The third call came about 15 minutes later, but this time, I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. The ringing stopped, but then a minute later, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail notification. I hesitated, then played it. The message was short, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. "They're there. You don't have much time. They're coming up. Hide." My heart started pounding. It wasn't funny anymore. It felt real, too real. I stood up, looking around my apartment, trying to shake off the anxiety that was gripping me. I was alone, but now I felt exposed, vulnerable. I walked to my front door and checked the locks, then double-checked them. As I stood there, my phone rang again, and my stomach dropped. I didn't want to answer it, but something made me pick it up. Before I could say anything, I heard noises in the background, a door creaking, footsteps, and then a whisper. "They're almost there." The call ended abruptly. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to check the peephole in my door. I leaned in, trying to keep my breathing steady. I didn't see anything at first, just the empty hallway. But then, faintly, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming closer. I froze, listening as they got louder, stopping right outside my door. I didn't dare look again. The footsteps stopped, and everything went quiet. Too quiet. I backed away from the door, moving slowly, trying not to make a sound. My apartment was small, nowhere to really hide. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind spinning, trying to figure out what to do. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only thing that made me feel a little safer. I moved to the corner of my living room, where I had a slight view of the front door, but could stay hidden in the shadows. I waited, gripping the knife so tightly my hand started to hurt. The silence was suffocating, every little creak in the building making me jump. I kept telling myself it was just a prank, that nobody was really out there. Then I heard a soft, almost inaudible scraping at the door. Someone was trying to pick the lock. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a joke. I knew it now. I held my breath, staying as still as possible. The scraping stopped, and the door handle jiggled slightly. I watched in terror as the handle slowly turned, but thankfully, the deadbolt held. Whoever was out there didn't give up. They tried again, this time with more force, but the door didn't budge. I could hear them muttering something, but the words were too muffled to make out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I kept praying they'd go away. Then, to my horror, I heard a second set of footsteps in the hallway, followed by a hushed conversation between the two intruders. Panic surged through me. There was more than one of them. I felt trapped with nowhere to go. I wanted to scream to call for help, but I was too terrified to make a sound. The door rattled again, harder this time, like they were trying to break it down. I heard one of them say, "We need to be quick." I knew I didn't have much time. I had to do something. I remembered the fire escape outside my bedroom window. It was a long shot, but it was my only option. Moving as quietly as I could, I backed away from the living room and into the bedroom. I tried to keep my movements slow, but I was shaking so much it was hard to stay calm. I reached the window and carefully lifted it, praying it wouldn't make any noise. The door in the living room made a loud crack as they forced it open. They were inside. I could hear them moving around, whispering to each other. I knew they'd find me any second. I climbed out onto the fire escape, nearly dropping the knife in my rush. The cold air hit me, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that apartment as possible. I started climbing down the metal stairs, my heart in my throat. I was halfway down when I heard them in the bedroom. I moved faster, not caring if they heard me now. I just needed to get away. As I reached the ground, I glanced up and saw them leaning out of the window, looking down at me. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw the cold determination in their faces. They didn't say anything, just watched as I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest street with people. I finally called the police, barely able to get the words out. They came quickly, but by the time we got back to my apartment, the intruders were gone. The door was smashed, and my apartment had been ransacked, but nothing was stolen. They hadn't been there to rob me. They were there for me. The police took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. They never found the men, and I never figured out who the caller was or how they knew what was happening. When I got home from work that day, everything felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was something about the house that just didn't seem right. I walked into the kitchen to put down my bag, and I noticed my favorite mug wasn't where I usually kept it. I always put it in the same spot on the middle shelf, but there it was on the top shelf. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had just put it there without realizing it. I moved into the living room, feeling a little uneasy, but trying to ignore it. My shoes by the door were turned the wrong way, toes pointing towards the wall instead of the door. That made me pause. I hadn't been rushing that morning, so I knew I had left them neatly. I told myself I was just overthinking things. It had been a long day, and I was probably just tired. I headed upstairs to change out of my work clothes. On the way, I passed the bathroom and saw that the towel on the rack was folded differently than I usually fold it. It wasn't much, just a little thing, but it stood out to me. I started to feel like I was losing it, like maybe I was just being paranoid. But then again, who would be in my house to move things around? When I got to my bedroom, the feeling got stronger. My bed looked too neat. I never make it that perfectly in the morning. I walked over to the closet to grab some clothes, but as I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. Something felt wrong. My hand hovered there, and for a second, I thought I heard a faint rustling sound inside. It was so quiet, I wasn't sure if I'd really heard it or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to open the door or just walk away. My heart started to race, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Finally, I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. At first, I didn't see anything, just my clothes hanging there like always. But then in the corner, behind a long coat, I saw him. A man crouched down, trying to make himself as small as possible. His eyes were wide, staring up at me, and for a split second, we just stood there frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My mind was blank, trying to process what I was seeing. He was real, not some figment of my imagination. There was a stranger in my house, in my closet, just a few feet away from me. He moved first. He lunged at me, pushing me back. I stumbled and fell onto the bed, the breath knocked out of me. My instincts kicked in, and I scrambled to get up, to get away, but he was faster. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back, and I felt pure panic flood my body. I managed to pull away, running out of the bedroom and down the stairs. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and fast. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran, bursting out the front door and into the street. I kept running until I reached my neighbor's house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. My neighbor opened the door, looking confused and alarmed. I barely managed to get the words out, telling him someone was in my house. He called the police while I stood there, shaking, feeling like my legs were about to give out. The police arrived quickly, but it felt like hours. They went into my house, guns drawn, searching every room. They found him still in the house, hiding in the bathroom this time. They dragged him out, handcuffed, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. The officers told me that he had no weapons on him, but they didn't know what his intentions were. They took him away, and I was left standing there, staring at my house, feeling like I didn't even recognize it anymore. It wasn't safe. It wasn't my home. Not after this. I spent the night at my neighbor's, too scared to go back inside my own house. I kept replaying everything in my head, all the little signs I'd ignored, all the ways I'd convinced myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was real, and it was terrifying. The next day, I went back to the house with a friend. I couldn't go alone. We checked every room, every closet, just to make sure. But the feeling didn't go away. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I never found out how he got in or why he was there. The police said he was likely a drifter, someone who saw an opportunity and took it. But that didn't make it any easier to deal with. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't opened the closet door, if I hadn't run fast enough. I changed the locks, added security cameras, did everything I could to make the house feel safe again. But it never really did. I moved out a few months later, unable to shake the fear that someone else might be hiding, waiting for me to come home. I still have nightmares about it, about opening doors and finding someone there, someone who shouldn't be. I was on a long drive through Nebraska, just trying to make it to the next town before dark. I'd been on the road for hours and needed a break, so when I saw a small diner off the highway, I pulled in. It was one of those places you don't see much anymore, a little rundown, with a faded sign and peeling paint. There were only a few cars in the lot, so I figured it would be quiet. Inside, it was just as old as it looked from the outside. The smell of greasy food hit me as soon as I walked in, but I didn't care. I was starving. I took a seat in a booth near the back, away from the few other people there. I liked sitting alone, especially after driving for so long. The waitress came over, looking tired, and I ordered a coffee and a burger. As I sat there waiting, I noticed two men sitting in the booth behind me. I hadn't paid attention to them when I walked in, but now I could hear their voices, low and serious. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were talking loud enough that it was hard not to hear. At first, it was just bits and pieces, nothing that made sense. But then one of them said something that caught my attention. "I told you, it's taken care of." "Nobody saw anything," the first man said. His voice was gruff, and I could tell he was trying to keep it down, but he was angry. "You better be right," the second man replied. He sounded nervous, like he was on edge. "If anyone finds out, we're screwed." I froze, my coffee halfway to my mouth. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it sounded like they were talking about something serious, something illegal. I tried to focus on my food, not wanting to draw any attention to myself, but my heart started pounding. I couldn't help but listen, my ears straining to catch every word. "They won't," the first man said, more confident now. "The body's gone, and the car's torched. No one's gonna find a damn thing." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My stomach turned, and suddenly I wasn't hungry anymore. They were talking about a murder, about covering it up. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want them to know I'd heard anything. I tried to keep calm, to finish my coffee like everything was normal, but my hands were shaking. I reached into my pocket for some cash to pay and glanced around the diner. The waitress was busy with another table, and nobody else seemed to be paying attention to the men's conversation. I decided I'd just leave the money on the table and slip out quietly. Maybe they wouldn't even notice me. But as I stood up, one of the men spoke again. "Hold on," he said, his voice low but firm. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "You think that guy hurt us?" I didn't dare turn around. I could feel their eyes on me, and I knew if I made any sudden moves, it would only make things worse. I tried to act normal, like I was just another customer leaving after a meal, but I could barely breathe. I placed the money on the table, my fingers trembling, and started to walk toward the door. As I reached the exit, I heard one of them say, "Let's find out." That was all it took. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, my legs feeling like jelly. I didn't look back, just headed straight for my car. My hands were shaking so badly, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them on the ground. I bent down to pick them up, and that's when I heard the door to the diner swing open behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them stepping out into the parking lot. They were watching me, their faces hard and unfriendly. Panic surged through me, and I finally managed to get the key into the lock. I yanked the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. My fingers were shaking so much, I could barely get the key into the ignition. I stole another glance at the men. They were walking toward my car, slowly but deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. I finally got the engine started and threw the car into reverse, my tires squealing as I backed out of the space. I didn't care if I hit something, I just needed to get out of there. As I pulled out onto the highway, I looked in the rearview mirror. The two men were standing in the parking lot, watching me drive away. I could see the anger in their faces, and I knew I wasn't safe yet. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as I sped down the road, my heart racing faster than the car. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see them following me, but the road was empty. Still, I didn't slow down. I drove for miles, not even knowing where I was going, just trying to put as much distance between me and that diner as possible. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard, what I'd almost gotten myself caught up in. When I finally pulled over, it was at a rest stop far from the diner. I was shaking all over, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I sat there in the car, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm down, but it was like the fear had taken hold of me and wouldn't let go. I kept thinking about those men, about what they'd said. They were dangerous, and I had no doubt they would have done something to me if I'd stayed any longer. I couldn't get their faces out of my head, the cold look in their eyes as they watched me leave. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until the sun came up, stopping only when I was too tired to keep my eyes open. Even then, I couldn't rest. Every sound made me jump, every shadow looked like someone coming to get me. It was only when I was far away, in another state, that I finally started to feel a little safer. But the fear didn't go away. It stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to something terrible. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? Now every time I pass a small diner on the side of the road, I think about that night, about what I heard, and how close I came to never leaving that place. It started with a letter I found in my mailbox. It was a regular evening. I'd just gotten home from work, tired and ready to relax. I live in an old apartment complex in Illinois, nothing fancy but decent enough. That day, I grabbed my mail without thinking much of it and headed upstairs to my unit. When I sat down to go through the pile of bills and ads, I noticed one envelope that wasn't addressed to me. It was plain, just a name and apartment number, but neither were mine. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, like someone had taken their time with it. The envelope had no return address, just my building's address and app 3C. I live in 4B, so I figured it was a simple mix-up. For a moment, I thought about leaving it by 3C's door, but then curiosity got the better of me. I'm not proud of it, but I opened the letter. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I did. The paper inside was just as plain as the envelope, but the words written on it weren't what I expected. They weren't friendly or mundane. They were terrifying. The letter described a crime in chilling detail, something violent, something cruel. It didn't say who had done it or where it happened, just the awful things that had been done to someone. It was sick, and the more I read, the more my hands started to shake. The words were written so matter-of-factly, like it was just business, like it didn't matter that someone's life had been ripped apart. My first thought was to throw it away, to pretend I'd never seen it. But then I remembered that it was meant for someone in 3C. Someone in my building was supposed to get this letter. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was knew what was inside, that they were part of whatever this was. I shoved the letter back into the envelope and tried to calm down. I told myself it was probably some sick joke, some twisted prank, but that didn't make the knot in my stomach go away. I kept thinking about the details, about the way it was all written out so calmly. That night, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept going back to the letter, reading it again and again, trying to make sense of it. I didn't know what to do. Should I take it to the police? Should I talk to whoever lives in 3C? But what if they were dangerous? What if they were the person who wrote it? It was getting late when I finally decided to just go to bed. I put the letter in a drawer and tried to forget about it. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing every little noise in the building, every creak and shuffle. I was jumpy, on edge, waiting for something to happen, even though I didn't know what. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard a loud banging on my door. My heart nearly stopped. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, harder this time. Someone was out there, and they were angry. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there in my bed, frozen, listening as the banging continued. They were shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I call the police? Should I answer? But then, through the noise, I heard them say something that made my blood run cold. "Give me the letter." They screamed, their voice muffled but clear enough. They knew I had it. Somehow they knew. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know how they knew, but they did. And they weren't going to leave until they got it back. The banging got louder, more desperate. They were practically throwing themselves against the door. I forced myself to move, to get out of bed. I grabbed the letter from the drawer and stood there, staring at the door. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely hold the envelope. They kept banging, kept shouting. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring them. They'd break the door down if I didn't do something. So I did the only thing I could think of. I walked to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and slid the envelope under it. The banging stopped immediately. For a moment, everything was dead silent. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and panicked, as I stood there waiting. Then I heard the sound of the envelope being picked up, the rustle of paper as they checked it. I held my breath, praying they would just take it and leave. And after what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps walking away, getting quieter until they were gone. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to convince myself it was over. But the fear didn't go away. I kept thinking about how they knew, how they'd come right to my door. They knew I'd opened it, knew I'd seen what was inside. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about what was in that letter, about the person who was supposed to get it. I kept wondering what would happen next, if they'd come back. I still don't know who they were, or how they knew I had it. The next morning, everything seemed normal again, like it had all been some terrible nightmare. But it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was out there waiting. I avoided 3C, took a different route out of the building, anything to keep from crossing paths with whoever lived there. I never told anyone about it. I didn't know how to explain what happened, and I was too scared to find out more. I just wanted to forget it, to move on, but it's not that easy. I keep looking over my shoulder, keep listening for any sign that they're still out there. I don't know what was in that letter, not really. But whatever it was enough to bring someone to my door in the middle of the night. Enough to make them desperate, enough to make them dangerous. And now, every time I walk past 3C, I wonder who's behind that door and what they're hiding. I first noticed something was off about my new neighbor about a week after he moved in. I live in a pretty quiet suburban neighborhood in Texas, where everyone minds their own business but waves when you pass by. The house next door had been empty for months, so when a moving truck finally pulled up, I was curious. But I never actually saw the new guy move in. One day the truck was there, the next day it was gone, and his car was in the driveway. At first, nothing seemed too weird. I'd see him come and go, but only late at night. He drove an old, beat-up sedan, and always wore a hat pulled low over his face. I figured he just worked night shifts or something. But then I started seeing him in the backyard at odd hours, like 2 or 3 in the morning. He was digging deep into the dirt, and then covering whatever he was digging with a tarp. That was strange enough, but then I noticed he covered all the windows of his house with black plastic. Every single window. It wasn't like he was just trying to block out the sun. It was like he didn't want anyone to see inside. That's when I started getting a bad feeling about the whole thing. A few days later, I decided to get a closer look. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but the curiosity was eating at me. It wasn't like me to pry into someone else's business, but something about this guy just felt wrong. I waited until it was dark, figuring it'd be easier to sneak around without getting caught. I stepped out into my backyard, staying close to the fence that separated our properties. The night was quiet, the air heavy and still. I could see his house clearly, and sure enough, there he was again, out in the backyard, digging away under the dim light of a single bulb hanging from his porch. I crouched down behind some bushes and watched him for a while. The longer I watched, the more I realized just how methodical he was. He wasn't just digging random holes, he was measuring the space, making sure everything was exact. And he never looked around, never seemed to check if anyone was watching. It was like he was completely focused on whatever he was doing. When he finally finished, he stood there for a moment, just staring at the hole. Then he started dragging something out of his garage, something long and lapped in a tarp. My heart started pounding as I realized it was the size of a body. He moved slowly, carefully, lowering the wrapped object into the hole before covering it with dirt. I don't know how long I stayed crouched behind those bushes, but it felt like forever. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I knew I should call the police, but something made me stay put, watching, waiting to see what he'd do next. After he finished burying whatever it was, he wiped his hands on his pants and headed back into the house. I waited a few minutes before standing up, my legs stiff from crouching so long. I felt a strange pull, an urge to check the spot he'd just covered up. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't stop myself. I climbed over the fence as quietly as I could, landing softly in his backyard. The dirt was freshly turned, easy to dig through. I started scraping it away with my hands, my heart pounding harder with every handful of dirt I moved. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something terrible. As I dug, I kept glancing back at the owls, half expecting him to come out and catch me. But the owls stayed dark and silent. I dug faster, the dirt flying around me, until my hands hit something solid, a tarp, just like the one I'd seen him drag out of the garage. My breath caught in my throat. I hesitated, then slowly peeled back the tarp, my fingers trembling. But just as I started to see what was underneath, I heard a creak behind me. I whipped around, and there he was, standing at the back door watching me. His face was in shadow, but I could see the glint of his eyes under the brim of his hat. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it might explode. I scrambled to my feet, not even bothering to cover the tarp back up, and bolted for the fence. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. I was over the fence and back in my yard in seconds, but I didn't stop. I ran straight into my house, locking the door behind me. I stood there in the dark, trying to catch my breath, my mind spinning. What the hell had I just seen? And why hadn't he stopped me? I peeked out the window, but his yard was dark. The light was off, and there was no sign of him. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the hole, the tarp, the way he just stood there watching me. I wanted to call the police, but I was too scared. What if he didn't believe me? What if he came after me, if he found out I'd reported him? The next morning, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see him standing there, staring back at me. But he was never there. I went to work, tried to focus on my job, but all I could think about was what I'd seen. When I got home that evening, his car was gone. The house was dark, just like it had been the night before. I waited, watching from my window, but he didn't come back. Days passed, and there was no sign of him. The bad feeling in my gut only got worse. One night, a few days later, I finally worked up the nerve to call the police. I told them everything about the digging, the tarp, the way he just stood there watching me. They sent someone over to check it out, but by the time they got there, it was too late. The backyard was empty. The hole had been filled in, the dirt smoothed over like nothing had ever happened. They knocked on his door, but there was no answer. The house was empty. They went inside, but they didn't find anything. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of a crime. Just an empty house with black plastic covering the windows. They told me there wasn't much they could do. Without any proof, it was just my word against nothing. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. After the police left, I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I left, crashing at a friend's place for a while. I kept thinking about the way he'd watch me, the way he knew I was there, digging up whatever he'd buried. I never found out what was in that hole, or where my neighbor went. The house stayed empty after that, eventually going up for sale. But I couldn't go back, not after what I'd seen. I moved out of that neighborhood, out of that town, trying to put as much distance between me and that place as I could. I parked my car in the underground garage just after 11 p.m. It was one of those big, concrete structures, the kind that seemed to swallow up sound. The echoes of my footsteps bounced off the walls as I walked to the elevator. The place was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered around, most of the lights flickering or dim. It had that stale smell like exhaust and old rainwater, and it always gave me the creeps. But it was Seattle, and finding parking on the street that late was impossible, so I didn't have much choice. I had gone out with some friends for dinner, nothing crazy. When I came back to the garage, it was even quieter than before, like the whole place was holding its breath. I stepped off the elevator on the lower level, where I'd left my car. My heels clicked on the concrete, and the sound seemed way too loud in the silence. I looked around, expecting to see my car just where I left it, but it wasn't there. I stood there for a moment, confused. Maybe I was just on the wrong level. That had to be it. I walked down the row, checking the other side, but my car wasn't anywhere. My heart started to race a little. It was a stupid mistake to make, but I was sure I'd parked here. I was tired, though. Maybe I was just mixed up. I went back to the elevator and tried another level. But again, no car. That uneasy feeling in my stomach started to grow. I knew I hadn't been wrong. I could picture exactly where I'd parked, right by that flickering light near the far wall. But the space was empty. I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd call someone, but the signal was terrible down there. The bars kept flickering in and out. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a mix-up, maybe a towing mistake or something. I started walking around the garage, checking every row, but each one was empty, just shadows and cold concrete. As I walked, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In one of the darker corners, just past a broken light, I saw movement. It wasn't much, just a shift in the darkness, like someone was standing there, watching me. I froze, squinting into the shadows, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone step out of the darkness, but the corner stayed still. I picked up my pace, my heels clicking faster on the concrete. I just wanted to find my car and get out of there. I reached the far end of the garage and turned around, thinking maybe I'd missed something. That's when I saw him. A man was standing a few rows over, just barely visible under one of the dim lights. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and he was looking right at me. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something about the way he stood, so still, that made my blood run cold. For a second, I thought about calling out to him, asking if he'd seen anything, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, hoping he'd just leave me alone. I didn't hear any footsteps, but I felt like he was following me, like his eyes were boring into the back of my head. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I needed to find my car, get to safety. I checked every row, every corner, but the garage was like a maze, and I felt more lost with every step. The man was nowhere to be seen now, but that just made it worse. I knew he was still there, somewhere in the shadows, watching. My breath was coming faster, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. I was trying to think of a plan, something that would get me out of this. I decided to head for the exit. Maybe I could find a security guard or someone who could help, but as I got closer to the exit, I saw the same man standing by the doors waiting. He was closer now, and I could see his face. It was blank, almost expressionless, but there was something cold in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, not sure what to do. He didn't move, just stood there, blocking my way out. I turned and walked quickly back into the garage, not caring about the noise my shoes made anymore. My only thought was to get away from him, but the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, thicker. My car was nowhere to be found, and I knew I was running out of time. I heard footsteps behind me, soft at first, then louder. He was following me. I broke into a run, not caring if he heard me. My heels clacked against the concrete as I sprinted down the rows, my breath coming in like it gasps. I didn't dare look back, too scared of what I might see. I rounded a corner, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but the footsteps were getting closer. My chest was tight, panic gripping me hard. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I had to find a way out, something to hide behind, anything. Suddenly, I saw a maintenance door slightly ajar at the end of the row. I sprinted toward it, yanking it open and slipping inside just as the footsteps rounded the corner behind me. I shut the door as quietly as I could, pressing my back against it and holding my breath. I was in a small, dark room filled with cleaning supplies and tools. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals. I listened, straining to hear anything outside, but all I could make out was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours. Every sound made me jump, every creak of the building convincing me that he was right outside. I didn't know if he'd seen me, if he was waiting for me to come out, or if he'd moved on, but I couldn't stay there forever. Slowly, I inched the door open just a crack, peeking out into the garage. It was empty, the rows stretching out in eerie silence. I didn't see him, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I slipped out of the room, staying low, and started moving toward the nearest exit. My car was gone. I knew that now. Maybe it had been stolen, maybe towed, or maybe something else entirely, but I couldn't worry about that anymore. I just needed to get out of there. As I approached the exit again, I scanned the area, my heart in my throat. I didn't see him, and the doors were in sight, just a few more steps. I forced myself to keep moving, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. Just as I reached the doors, I heard a sound behind me, a soft, slow scrape of a shoe against concrete. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I pushed through the doors and into the stairwell, practically leaping down the steps two at a time. I could hear him now, right behind me, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. I burst out onto the street, the cool night air hitting me like a shock. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, surrounded by the lights and noise of the city. Only then did I look back, but the street was empty, no sign of him anywhere. I found a cab and got in, shaking all over. As we pulled away, I couldn't help but look back at the garage, half expecting to see him standing in the doorway, watching me leave. But there was nothing. I was driving through Oregon, just passing through on a long road trip. It was getting late, and I'd been on the road for hours without a break, so when I saw a sign for a rest area, I figured I'd stop. It was one of those small, out-of-the-way spots, just a couple of picnic tables and a restroom building, surrounded by trees. There wasn't another car in sight, but I didn't think much of it. The place seemed deserted. I parked my car and got out, stretching my legs before heading to the restroom. The air was cool, and everything was quiet, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The building looked old, worn down, but I didn't care. I just needed to use the bathroom and get back on the road. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. It was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering every few seconds. The smell of old, stale air hit me as I walked further in, my footsteps echoing off the tile floor. There were a few stalls on one side and a row of sinks on the other. It was completely empty. I picked a stall near the back, not really paying attention to anything else. I just wanted to get in and out as fast as possible. The door creaked as I shut it behind me, and I could hear the faint sound of the wind outside, whistling through the cracks in the walls. I finished up and flushed, then went to open the stall door, but it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, thinking it was just stuck, but it still wouldn't move. That's when I realized something was wrong. I hadn't locked it, so there was no reason for it to be jammed like that. I tried again, harder this time, but it didn't move an inch. My heart started pounding, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. Maybe the door was just old, maybe it was swollen or something. But no matter how hard I pushed, it wouldn't give. Panic started to creep in, but I told myself to relax. I decided to crawl under the door, but as I crouched down, I heard voices outside, muffled but clear enough to make out some words. They were talking about me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I listened. There were at least 2 of them, maybe more, their voices low but tense. I couldn't hear everything, but what I caught was enough to send a chill down my spine. When he comes out, not yet. Don't mess this up. They were waiting for me. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but it was clear that whatever they had planned, it wasn't good. I pressed my ear to the stall door, trying to make out more, but the voices faded and I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my own heart. I looked around the stall, desperate for a way out. The window was too high and too small to crawl through, and the door was still jammed tight. My mind raced as I tried to think of something, anything that could help me. I thought about calling for help, but my phone was in the car, and even if I had it, I doubted there'd be a signal out here. I stood there, trapped, every second feeling like an hour. The voices outside started up again, louder this time, closer. They were arguing, and I caught the tail end of a sentence that made my blood run cold. Should just break it down. I knew I didn't have much time. They were getting impatient, and it wouldn't be long before they decided to force their way in. I looked around the stall again, and that's when I saw a small vent near the floor, just big enough for me to crawl through if I could break the cover off. I hurried over to it, my hands shaking as I tried to pry the cover off with my fingers. It was rusted and loose, but it wasn't coming off easily. The voices outside grew louder, more agitated. I could hear footsteps now, pacing back and forth, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I knew I didn't have much time. I gave the vent cover one last yank, and it finally gave way, the metal screeching as it came loose. I didn't waste a second. I dropped to the floor and started crawling through the narrow space, the metal edges scraping against my skin as I wriggled through. The vent was tight, claustrophobic, and I could barely move. I could hear the voices getting closer, their footsteps echoing in the restroom. I crawled faster, pushing myself through the cramped space, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where the vent led, but anywhere was better than where I was. Just as I made it to the other side, I heard a loud crash behind me, the sound of the stalled door being kicked open. They were in the restroom now, just a few feet away, but I didn't stop. I crawled out of the vent and found myself in a small maintenance room, dark and cluttered with old cleaning supplies. I didn't have time to think. I spotted a door on the other side of the room and made a break for it, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the handle. I could hear them behind me, their voices angry now, shouting at each other. The door finally gave way, and I burst out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition. I didn't look back as I sped out of the rest area, the tires screeching on the pavement. My heart was racing and I couldn't stop shaking, the fear still gripping me tight. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the rest area far behind me. Even then I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see them following me. I never did. I rented a cabin in Vermont for the weekend, hoping to get some peace and quiet away from everything. It was in the middle of the woods, really secluded. When I got there, it looked just like the pictures, small but cozy, with a big fireplace and windows that let in a lot of light. It was supposed to be a perfect little escape. The first day was nice. I settled in, made myself some coffee, and read a book by the fire. The only sounds were the crackling of fire and the wind outside. It felt like I was the only person in the world. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable and the cabin was warm, but I couldn't sleep right away. I kept hearing noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe some animals moving around. The woods were full of life, after all. But the noises were strange, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or something like that, but it was hard to ignore. I finally fell asleep after convincing myself I was being silly. The next morning, I felt a little embarrassed about how nervous I'd been. I made breakfast and decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The air was crisp and everything was so quiet. It was like the world was on mute. But as I walked around, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were muddy footprints leading up to the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't been out in the mud since I arrived, and these prints were fresh. They led right up to the back door and stopped there. I stared at them for a while, my mind racing, trying to figure out how they got there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside last night, right up against the cabin. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a hiker got lost or something, but I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. I decided not to let it ruin my day. I tried to relax, but every little noise outside made me jumpy. That night, the noises started again. It was the same slow, steady sound of footsteps. I listened from bed, my heart pounding in my chest. They were closer this time, right outside the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I was too scared of what I might see. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, praying it would stop. Eventually it did, but I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about those footprints and how close they were to my door. I felt like I was being watched. I got out of bed and double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I ended up sitting by the fireplace, trying to keep my mind off it, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. In the morning, I decided to leave the cabin for a while, thinking I might feel better if I got out and did something. I drove into town, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I grabbed some lunch, wandered around a few shops, and tried to enjoy the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following me, but whenever I turned around, no one was there. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were more footprints, fresh ones, leading from the woods to my bedroom window. They were the same size as the ones I'd seen before, deep and clear in the mud. Whoever it was, they had been standing right outside my window, looking in while I wasn't there. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to leave, but it was getting dark, and the idea of driving through the woods at night alone scared me just as much. I decided to stay in the cabin, but I kept all the lights on, every door and window locked tight. I grabbed a kitchen knife and kept it with me just in case. I was so on edge, jumping at every little sound. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the couch, listening, waiting. The footsteps came again, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I could hear them moving around, stopping every so often, like they were trying to find a way in. I held the knife tight, my hands shaking. I didn't know what they wanted or who they were, but I knew I wasn't alone. At one point, the footsteps stopped right outside the back door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but it was just silence. Long, heavy silence. Then the doorknob started to turn slowly, as if someone was testing to see if it was locked. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I wanted to scream, but I didn't make a sound. The doorknob rattled for a few more seconds, then stopped. I didn't hear anything after that. The footsteps were gone, but I knew they were still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting. I stayed up all night, too scared to move, too scared to even look out the window. I kept imagining those muddy footprints and the person who left them, standing right outside, just waiting for me to make a mistake. When the sun finally came up, I grabbed my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't care about the rest of the weekend. I just wanted to get out of there. I went for a jog last night. It was late, probably around 10:30. I needed to clear my head, you know? Work had been stressing me out, and I just needed to get out of the house. The park near my place is usually pretty quiet at that time. It's got a few dim streetlights, but mostly it's just a glow from the city in the distance. I figured it would be a good place to think, no distractions. The air was cool, and the paths were empty. It was peaceful at first, just the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a little better as I settled into a rhythm. There's something about the steady pace of running that helps me sort out my thoughts. After a while, I noticed something strange. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but something felt off. I glanced over my shoulder and didn't see anything, so I kept going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped to listen, they stopped too. I stood there, catching my breath, listening hard, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I shrugged it off and started running again, but that feeling came back almost immediately. It was like someone was matching my pace, just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was nothing, maybe just the echo of my own footsteps or a stray animal in the bushes, but it didn't feel right. I decided to pick up the pace a little, just to see if I could shake it off. That's when I heard it for sure. Footsteps, clear as day, right behind me. They matched my speed, keeping perfect time with my own. My heart started to race, and I turned around, but there was no one there. Just empty park behind me. The path was lit by those old streetlights, casting long shadows, but I couldn't see anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just the wind or the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the trees. But then I heard it again, this time louder, like whoever it was had picked up speed too. I didn't look back again. I just started running faster. My legs were burning, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I reached the edge of the park where the path loops back toward the main road. I slowed down a bit, thinking maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But when I looked over my shoulder, I saw a figure in the distance, just at the edge of the light. They were standing still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, but I knew they had been following me. I panicked. I bolted for the road, my breath coming in short gasps. I could hear them running behind me, closing the distance. Whoever it was, they were fast. I didn't dare turn around again. I just kept my eyes on the streetlights ahead, praying I'd make it to the main road where there might be cars or people or anything that could help. I could hear them getting closer, their footsteps pounding on the pavement. They were right behind me. My legs were screaming, and I felt like I was going to collapse, but I kept going, pushing myself as hard as I could. I could almost feel them reaching out to grab me, and that terror pushed me even faster. Finally, I burst out of the park and onto the road. There were cars driving by, and the sight of them felt like a lifeline. I stumbled to a stop, my chest heaving, looking around wildly for whoever had been chasing me, but there was no one there. The park was dark and empty behind me. I stood there under the streetlight, shaking and drenched in sweat, but the figure was gone. I didn't stick around to see if they'd come back. I ran home as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that dark figure again. But the streets were empty. By the time I got back to my apartment, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key in the door. I locked myself inside and collapsed onto the couch, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head. I kept hearing those footsteps in my mind, pounding behind me, getting closer and closer. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing there, just watching me from the shadows. I kept the lights on, checking the windows every few minutes to make sure no one was outside. I felt like I was losing it, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but it was so real. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whoever was in the park might still be out there, watching me. I kept the curtains drawn and stayed inside all day, too scared to go out. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps chasing me through the park. I haven't been back to that park since. I can't even walk by it without feeling that same panic rise up in my chest. I keep telling myself it was just some creep messing with me, but it doesn't help. I can't forget how fast they were, how close they got. I've tried going for runs in different places, but I can't shake the fear that someone's following me. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that aren't there. I got home from work around 7 p.m. that night. I was too tired to cook, so I decided to order some food. There's this little Thai place I always order from, and their delivery is usually pretty quick. I placed the order through the app, a simple pad thai and some spring rolls, nothing fancy. About 30 minutes later, I heard a knock at the door. It was sooner than I expected, but I figured maybe they weren't too busy. I opened the door, and there was a guy standing there with a plastic bag. He looked like a typical delivery guy, worn-out jacket, cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say much, just handed me the bag. I thanked him, but he didn't leave right away. He just kind of stood there for a moment, looking at me. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't think much of it at the time. He finally turned and walked away, and I closed the door. I remember feeling a bit off, like something wasn't right, but I shook it off and went to the kitchen. I put the bag on the counter and opened it up. But when I looked inside, I was confused. There was no food, just a couple of old newspapers stuffed inside. I thought it was some kind of mistake, or maybe a prank. I was annoyed, so I picked up my phone to call the restaurant. Before I could dial, there was another knock at the door. It was loud, urgent, like someone was in a hurry. I froze for a second, a weird feeling creeping up my spine. I went to the door, and without thinking, I opened it. The same guy was standing there. He didn't have the bag this time, and he didn't look like he was in a hurry to leave. His cap was lower, almost hiding his eyes. I asked him what was going on, where my food was, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. I backed up, stunned. I remember thinking this couldn't be happening. He wasn't supposed to come in. Delivery guys don't just walk into your apartment. My heart started racing, but I didn't want to panic. He looked around like he was checking the place out. My brain was screaming at me to do something, to say something, but I couldn't get any words out. I just stood there, frozen, as he wandered into my living room. I asked him to leave, trying to keep my voice steady, but he didn't even look at me. He walked around, picking up random things, my keys, a magazine, even a picture frame. He wasn't in a hurry, and that scared me more than anything. It was like he knew he had all time in the world, like he wasn't worried about me trying to stop him. Finally, I snapped out of it and demanded he leave. I tried to sound tough, but my voice shook. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw his face for the first time. There was something wrong with his eyes, something cold and empty. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like he was amused, like he knew I was scared. He put the picture frame down and walked towards me. I backed up until I was against the wall. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't have my phone with me. It was still on the counter in the kitchen. I didn't know if I should run or scream, or try to fight him off. He stopped just a few feet away from me, and tilted his head like he was thinking about something. Then, without saying a word, he turned and walked out of the apartment. He didn't run, didn't slam the door, just walked. I stood there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally moved, I ran to the door and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the lock. I grabbed my phone and called the restaurant, but they said no one had been sent out yet. My order was still being prepared. I hung up and called the police. When they arrived, they didn't find anything. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. Just some weirdo, they said, probably harmless. They promised to keep an eye out, but I knew they wouldn't find him. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up, trying to decide what to do. I kept hearing that knock on the door, over and over in my head. Every little noise made me jump. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. I started staying with a friend after that, too scared to be alone in the apartment. I haven't been back since. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. I keep thinking about that smile, that empty look in his eyes, and I know I'll never forget it. I don't know what he wanted, or why he chose me, but I'm just glad I got out of there before he did anything worse. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't finally found my voice, if I hadn't demanded he leave. I just hope I never see him again. I was working late at the office one night. It was just after 9 p.m., and the building was mostly empty. I was finishing up a report that was due the next day. The office was eerily quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clatter of a stray paper or two. When I finally wrapped up, I decided it was time to head home. I packed up my things and went to the elevator. I pressed the button and waited. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, glad to be heading home. Just as the doors were about to close, another man slipped in quickly. I glanced at him, and he seemed off. He was disheveled, like he'd been running or something. His clothes were wrinkled and a little dirty, and he had this wild look in his eyes. I tried to ignore him, and just focused on the numbers lighting up as the elevator started to move. The elevator jolted suddenly, and the lights flickered. I felt a small rush of panic as the lights went out completely for a few seconds. When they came back on, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man's hands were smeared with what looked like blood. It wasn't just a small amount, either, it was a lot. My mind raced. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, but I couldn't find the words. I just stood there, trying to stay calm. The man seemed to sense my unease. He looked at me with these wide, unblinking eyes, and I could see the fear in his expression. It was like he was trapped in his own world, unable to focus on anything else. The elevator stopped moving, and the lights flickered again. I could hear the faint buzzing of the emergency light above us. The man took a deep breath, and I noticed his hands were shaky. He glanced around the elevator, then back at me, as if he was trying to make sense of something. "Is something wrong?" I finally managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. My throat felt dry, and my heart was pounding in my chest. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, and I could see his eyes darting around, like he was trying to remember something. The silence in the elevator was deafening. I wanted to press the emergency button, but my hands felt like lead. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "They're coming," he said, his voice trembling. "They're going to find me." I didn't understand what he meant. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I could see the fear in his eyes, and it made me even more nervous. He didn't answer. Instead, he started pacing back and forth in the small space. His hands, still covered in blood, were swinging wildly. Every now and then, he would stop and stare at the elevator doors as if he was expecting them to open at any moment. I tried to stay as far away from him as possible. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. The thought of what he might have done, or who might be after him, sent chills down my spine. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to stay calm and avoid provoking him. The elevator jolted again, and the lights flickered more violently this time. I heard a faint thud from somewhere above, and the elevator stopped moving. My heart was racing, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to press the emergency button, but it didn't seem to be working. The man's breathing grew heavier, more erratic. He seemed to be having some kind of breakdown. I could see his eyes darting around the elevator, and he was muttering to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone was desperate and frantic. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the elevator wasn't moving. I looked around, trying to find something that could help. The emergency phone in the elevator was out of order. I felt completely trapped. The thought of being stuck in there with someone who might be dangerous was terrifying. Suddenly, the man stopped pacing and turned to me. His eyes were wide, and he looked like he was about to say something, but then he just slumped against the wall. He slid down to the floor, his back against the elevator wall. His breathing was heavy, and he seemed exhausted. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I heard the faint sound of rescue workers talking outside the elevator shaft. I could barely hear them, but the sound gave me a glimmer of hope. Eventually, the elevator door started to open slowly. The light from the hallway poured in, and I saw a team of rescue workers in the doorway. They looked at the man on the floor and then at me. I could see the concern in their eyes. One of the workers stepped inside and checked on the man, while another one helped me out of the elevator. They asked me questions, but I was too shaken to answer properly. I just pointed to the man and told them he needed help. They took over from there, carefully assessing the situation. The man was still sitting on the floor, his hands still smeared with blood. I couldn't tell if he was conscious or not. I felt a wave of relief as I was let out of the building. I later learned that the man was taken into custody and taken to the hospital. It turned out that he had been involved in a violent incident, and the blood on his hands was from that. The police handled everything from there. I still think about that night sometimes. The feeling of being trapped in the elevator with someone so unstable, not knowing what might happen next, it's something I can't forget. It was a few months ago, late summer in Arizona. I was driving down this deserted road, heading home from a long day at work. It was past dusk, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. The road stretched out for miles with hardly any traffic. I was used to the isolation, but that night it felt more intense. As I drove, I saw a figure on the side of the road. A man was standing there with a thumb out, clearly hitchhiking. I hesitated at first, but I couldn't ignore the thought of someone being out there alone in the dark. I pulled over, and he got in. He seemed normal at first, just an average guy in his late 20s or so. He introduced himself as Matt, and said he was trying to get to a town a bit farther down the road. I agreed to give him a ride, since it wasn't much out of my way. We chatted for a while. He talked about his trip and his plans, nothing out of the ordinary. The conversation was light and polite, but then he started asking personal questions. Questions about my job, my family, where I was heading. At first, I thought he was just making small talk, trying to be friendly. As the conversation went on, his questions became more specific. He asked about my house, the neighborhood I lived in, and how long I had been living there. I found it odd, but brushed it off as harmless curiosity. I gave vague answers, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. He mentioned knowing about the new dog I had just adopted. I hadn't told him anything about my dog. I hadn't even mentioned getting one recently. My heart started racing. I asked him how he knew about it, and he just smiled and shrugged. "You talk about it sometimes," he said. "It's not hard to pick up on." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I don't talk about my personal life much." I was trying to stay calm, but his casual tone was making me uneasy. The questions continued, and he seemed to know things he shouldn't. He talked about my recent vacation, which was supposed to be a secret. My anxiety grew with each word. I decided it was time to cut the conversation short. I told him I was feeling tired and needed some quiet. He didn't push further, but I could sense a change in his demeanor. He seemed to settle back into his seat, but the atmosphere in the car was tense. Suddenly, he asked, "Do you ever think about what might happen if you just disappeared?" The question came out of nowhere, and it sounded almost philosophical, but with a strange undertone. Micah told me something was seriously wrong. I tried to focus on the road, but my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced at him from time to time, trying to gauge his mood. He was staring out the window, but his reflection in the glass showed a slight smile that made my stomach churn. My mind raced through various scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. I considered stopping the car and asking him to leave, but the road was so isolated and it felt dangerous to do so. I feared what might happen if I provoked him. Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense anymore, we reached a small town. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, near a gas station. I turned to him and said, "This is where you get off. It's not far from where you want to go." He looked at me, and for a moment his expression softened. "Thanks for the ride," he said, but his eyes still held that unsettling glint. He got out of the car slowly, still keeping his gaze on me. As he closed the door, I noticed he left a small envelope on the seat. My heart pounded as I watched him walk away, disappearing into the shadows. Once he was out of sight, I picked up the envelope, my hands shaking. It was addressed to me, but there was no return address. I decided to open it later, when I was somewhere safe. I drove away quickly, my mind racing. I felt like I had narrowly escaped something horrible. Once I was home, I locked all the doors and sat down with the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in a neat, but chilling handwriting. The message read, "It's not over. You'll see me again. Until then, take care of that dog." I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I had to take it seriously. I reported the incident to the police and showed them the note. They took it seriously, but said they couldn't do much without more information. I still think about that night. I haven't picked up any more hitchhikers since then, and I make sure to be extra cautious when driving alone. I've been living in my apartment complex in Ohio for a few years now. It's a quiet place, always seen safe. I got home from work late every day, usually around 8 or 9 p.m. For the last few weeks, something strange started happening. It began with a feeling of being watched. I'd noticed someone behind me, but I never saw them clearly. I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe I was being paranoid. Then I started noticing patterns. Someone seemed to be trailing me every night. They would follow from a distance, just enough so I could barely make them out. At first, I figured it was just a coincidence. I tried different routes home, but the feeling of being followed remained constant. There were times I would quicken my pace, and so would the person behind me. I started to keep track of my surroundings more carefully. One night, I made a point to walk slowly, glancing behind me now and then. I saw a shadowy figure not far back, just enough that I couldn't make out any details. My heart started racing. I tried to stay calm, hoping they would lose interest and leave. When I reached my building, I turned around sharply and faced the person who had been following me. They were already turning the corner, trying to disappear from sight. I ran to the corner to catch a glimpse, but by then, they had vanished. The next day, I was more vigilant. I watched for anyone who seemed out of place, but the person was gone. I thought maybe it was a one-time thing, but the following evening it started again. The same figure, always at the same distance. I decided to take action. That night, I walked home with my phone ready to dial 911. I even took a few detours, but the figure stayed behind me, never closing the gap. When I reached my apartment, I was determined to confront them. I got inside quickly, locked my door, and peered through the peephole. I saw the figure standing near the entrance to my building, watching. I stayed quiet, waiting for them to leave. But they didn't move. I was trapped inside, knowing they were waiting for me to come out. The next day, I saw the same figure, now closer to my apartment than before. They were standing right outside my building, almost as if they were waiting for me to come out. I tried to act normal, but my anxiety was through the roof. I tried to blend in with the crowd of people walking to work. I couldn't ignore the danger I felt. I decided to report it to the building manager, explaining how someone had been following me home. The manager took me seriously and promised to look into it. They suggested I keep my doors locked and be cautious. That night, I got home and saw no sign of the person following me. Maybe the building manager had done something, or perhaps they had just stopped. I let my guard down a bit, but I kept checking outside every few minutes. A few days later, I came home early and saw the figure again. They were standing right outside my apartment door. My heart skipped a beat. I called the police, but they said they couldn't do much without more evidence. The next day, the building manager arranged for extra security patrols. I felt a little safer knowing someone would be keeping watch. The figure was still around, but they never came close to my apartment again. It continued like this for a while. The figure would follow me but never get too close. They seemed to be taunting me, showing up near my apartment and then disappearing. It was clear they were trying to unsettle me, and it worked. Eventually, the figure stopped appearing. I don't know if they moved on, or if the increased security made them back off. I still watch my surroundings more carefully now. I make sure my doors are locked, and I stay aware of my surroundings. The experience left me shaken, and I'm more cautious about who I let into my life. It was a relief when the figure finally disappeared, but the fear and tension lingered for a long time. I was house-sitting for my parents while they were away on vacation. Their house is in a quiet part of Pennsylvania, surrounded by trees and hills. It was supposed to be a peaceful week. The first few days went by without incident. I took care of the mail, watered the plants, and kept the house in order. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. I paused, thinking it was just the house settling, but the sounds continued, slow and deliberate. I went upstairs to check, but there was no one there. I checked all the rooms, even the bathroom, and found nothing out of the ordinary. The footsteps seemed to stop, so I went back downstairs. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or some noise from the old house. I locked up, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The noise did not come back that night, and I managed to sleep, though I woke up a few times feeling uneasy. The next morning, I was making coffee when I noticed the attic door was open. I don't remember ever seeing it open before. The attic was a place I had never really explored. My parents kept it locked up for as long as I could remember. It was strange that it was open now. I went to the attic door, which was at the end of the hall. The door was heavy and dusty. I pushed it open slowly, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading up to the attic. The light in the hallway didn't reach very far up there, so it was dark. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made my way up the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the air was musty and stale. I reached the top and shone the light around. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten items. I carefully walked through the attic, shining my light on everything. There was nothing unusual, just old things covered in sheets and dust. I saw an old rocking chair, some old trunks, and several cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. Still uneasy, I went back downstairs and closed the attic door. I checked all the windows and doors to make sure everything was secure. I didn't know why the attic door had been open, but I wanted to make sure it was closed and locked. That night, I was on edge. I kept hearing small noises, like scratching or shifting, coming from above. I convinced myself it was just the house settling again. I tried to stay calm and get some sleep, but each time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that attic door. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. They were louder this time, and it sounded like they were moving around upstairs. I got up and went to check, but when I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. The upstairs was silent. I went to each room, but everything seemed normal. When I got back to my room, I locked the door behind me. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down. The noises didn't come back, and eventually I fell asleep, though it was a restless night. The next morning, I found the attic door open again. It was almost as if someone had been up there during the night. I went up to check once more, but there was nothing different. The attic was as I had left it. I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the door again. I called my parents and told them about the noises and the open attic door. They were concerned but reassured me that the house was old and creaky. They suggested I check the locks and make sure everything was secure. I agreed and spent the rest of the day making sure the house was as secure as possible. That night, I made sure to lock the attic door tightly. I even put a small chair against the door, just in case. I went to bed, trying to ignore the fear that had settled in my stomach. The next few nights were uneventful. I didn't hear any more footsteps or strange noises. It was as if whatever had been bothering me had finally stopped. My parents returned home, and I was relieved to hand the house back to them. I never mentioned the noises or the attic door to them. They had enough to worry about, and I didn't want to add to their stress. I was just glad that my time house sitting was over and that I could go back to my own place. Looking back, I'm still not sure what was going on. Maybe it was just an old house making odd noises, or maybe someone had been trying to scare me. I took a late-night train from New Jersey to get home after a long day. I was exhausted and just wanted to get back. The train was pretty empty, and I found a seat towards the middle. I settled in and tried to relax, but the journey seemed to drag on longer than usual. As the train picked up speed, I noticed a group of 3 men sitting a few rows ahead of me. They were talking loudly, but I wasn't paying much attention until I heard one of them mention something about a big mess and getting rid of the evidence. My curiosity got the better of me, so I tried to listen in without being too obvious. The men's conversation got detailed. They started talking about a crime they had just committed. The way they spoke was chilling. They discussed how they had planned everything, and how they had made sure not to leave any clues behind. My heart started racing as I realized the seriousness of what they were talking about. I knew I had to be careful. I didn't want to get involved or draw attention to myself. I kept my head down and tried to focus on my phone, pretending to scroll through social media, but I couldn't help glancing over at them from time to time. The men were animated, and their conversation became more intense. One of them suddenly looked back towards my direction. I froze, my heart pounding. He seemed to make a contact with me for a split second before turning away. I hoped he hadn't noticed me listening. I kept my gaze fixed on my phone, trying to ignore the feeling of dread creeping over me. A few minutes later, one of the men got up and walked towards where I was sitting. He stopped a couple of rows away, his eyes scanning the empty seats. I held my breath, trying to act as normal as possible. He eventually turned and walked back to his friends. I could hear them laughing quietly now, but it did nothing to ease my nerves. When the train slowed down for a station stop, I considered getting off to avoid any confrontation, but I was too far from the door and the train was still moving. I wasn't sure if getting off would even help. I could hear the group getting more animated again, their voices rising. The train started moving again, and the tension in the air was palpable. I glanced towards the men once more, and saw that they were now all staring in my direction. They had clearly noticed me. One of them, the one who had looked at me earlier, gave me a chilling smile. It was then that I understood they knew I had overheard their conversation. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. I considered going to the conductor, but I didn't want to make any sudden movements that could provoke them. I needed to stay calm and think carefully. The group seemed to discuss their plans again, their voices getting lower and more menacing. One of them said he's heard too much. We can't let him get off the train. My blood ran cold. They were talking about me. I had to find a way to protect myself. I decided to go to the bathroom, hoping it might buy me some time. I walked as quickly as I could without drawing attention. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady my breathing. I thought about my options, but nothing seemed like a good plan. I knew I had to get off the train and find safety, but the station wasn't for another while. I waited in the bathroom, my heart racing with every sound I heard. I could hear footsteps in the hallway, and I prayed they wouldn't come near the bathroom. After what felt like an eternity, the train slowed again. It was a small station, and I hoped it was a stop where I could get off quickly. I waited for the train to stop, and when it did, I peeked out of the bathroom to see if it was clear. The hallway was empty, but I could hear the group's voices coming closer. I knew I had to act fast. I slipped out of the bathroom and made my way to the nearest exit. I kept my head down, trying to blend in with the few passengers who were getting off. As soon as the train came to a complete stop, I rushed out and headed towards the station building. I didn't look back, but I could hear the group's voices fading as they stayed on the train. I felt a rush of relief as I entered the station and saw a security guard near the entrance. I approached the guard and told him everything that had happened. He called the authorities, and I gave them my statement. They were concerned and promised to investigate. They assured me that the train would be checked, and they would look into the group of men I described. I waited at the station until my ride arrived. The whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how close I had come to something terrible. When I finally got home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and safety. The incident made me more cautious about traveling late at night. I checked into the motel just outside of Baton Rouge around dusk. The air was thick with humidity, and I was tired from driving all day. The place was in much a single-story building with faded blue paint and a sign that flickered every few seconds. But it was cheap, and that's all I cared about at the time. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when I handed her my card. She gave me a room key and pointed down the hall without saying a word. The room was small, just a bed, a TV mounted on the wall, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to even think about finding somewhere else to stay. After a quick shower, I got into bed, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. I'd been on the road for hours, and my mind was playing tricks on me. It was around midnight when I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft tapping, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the motel was almost empty when I checked in. I waited, hoping it was just a mistake, but the knocking continued, more insistent this time. I got out of bed, my feet sinking into the thin carpet, and walked slowly to the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, debating whether or not to open it. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just some kids messing around, and went back to bed. Not 5 minutes later, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more urgent. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I knew I should ignore it, but something in me wanted to confront whoever was out there. I threw the covers off and marched to the door, this time swinging it open without checking the peephole. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead lights, flickering slightly, as if they might go out at any second. I stepped out into the hall, looking left and right, but saw nothing. The other doors were closed, and the place was eerily quiet. I shut the door and locked it, double-checking the chain. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My nerves were on edge, and every little noise made me jump. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, the knocking came again. This time, it was different, slow, deliberate, like whoever was out there was trying to get a rise out of me. I clenched my teeth, willing myself to stay in bed, but the sound kept coming, persistent and unnerving. I finally snapped. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and rushed to the door. But before I could open it, I noticed something. A small piece of paper had been slipped under the door, just barely visible in the dim light. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The paper was old, yellowed around the edges, like it had been crumpled up and flattened out again. There was writing on it, scrawled in a messy, almost frantic hand. It was just my name. Nothing else. No message, no explanation. Just my name. A chill ran down my spine. I looked at the door, then back at the note, my mind racing. How did they know my name? I hadn't spoken to anyone except the woman at the front desk, and she didn't seem the type to play pranks. I glanced at the peephole again, but the hallway was still empty. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to figure out what to do. Every instinct told me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my mind spinning with possibilities. Was someone watching me? Had they been following me since I checked in? The thought made my skin crawl. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my bag, stuffing my things into it as quickly as I could. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely zip it up. I knew I had to get out of there, but the thought of opening the door again filled me with dread. Just as I reached for the doorknob, the knocking started again. It was louder this time, almost frantic, like they were trying to break the door down. I stumbled back, dropping my bag, and ran to the bathroom. I locked the door behind me, my heart pounding in my ears. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, trying to control my breathing. The knocking continued, relentless and unnerving. I stared at the bathroom door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I wasn't safe. The knocking finally stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. Just that oppressive, suffocating silence. I stayed in the bathroom for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I crept back into the room, my eyes darting to the door. There was no sound, no sign of anyone outside. The piece of paper with my name on it lay on the floor where I dropped it, a stark reminder of how real this all was. I crapped my bag and bolted for the door. I didn't even check the hallway this time. I just ran, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty corridor. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped out of the parking lot. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone was watching me leave. All I could think about was putting as much distance between me and that motel as possible. I drove for hours, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over again. I got off the bus thinking it was the right stop. It was just after sunset, the light fading fast, and I quickly realized I made a mistake. The bus pulled away, kicking up dust, leaving me in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around, just an empty road stretching out in both directions. No buildings, no streetlights, nothing. I looked at my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could just walk to the next stop or find a town up ahead. It couldn't be that far, right? But as I started walking, I got this sinking feeling in my gut. The road was too quiet. No cars, no noise, just the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. I kept walking, hoping I'd see a sign or something soon. After a while, I heard a car approaching from behind. I turned around, relieved at first, thinking I could maybe hitch a ride. But as the car got closer, it slowed down. It didn't pass me, just crept along at my walking pace. I couldn't see who was driving, the headlights were too bright, blinding me. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe they were just being cautious, but it felt wrong. My instincts were screaming at me. I quickened my pace, hoping they'd get bored and drive on, but the car stayed right behind me. That's when the fear really set in. I glanced over my shoulder again, and the car was still there, following me like a shadow. I decided to walk faster, my heart pounding in my chest. The car kept up, the engine humming quietly as it rolled along beside me. I thought about running, but the road was so empty, so exposed. There was nowhere to hide, just open desert stretching out on either side. If I ran, they could easily catch up. I tried to think of another plan, but my mind was racing, and I couldn't focus. Suddenly, the car sped up and pulled in front of me, blocking my path. The door opened, and I saw a man step out. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood there for a moment, just watching me, and I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He called out to me, his voice too casual, asking if I needed a ride. I shook my head, trying to keep my distance, but he took a step closer. I told him I was fine, that I was just going to keep walking, but he didn't seem to care what I said. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I backed away, and that's when he lunged at me. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I heard him shout something, but I didn't stop to listen. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running, not daring to look back. The sound of the car engine roared behind me. I knew he was chasing me, the tires screeching as he tried to catch up. I veered off the road, stumbling into the desert, hoping the rough terrain would slow him down. The ground was uneven, rocks and bushes tripping me up, but I didn't stop. I could hear the car crashing through the brush, the headlights cutting through the darkness, getting closer. I spotted a small ridge up ahead and sprinted towards it. My only thought was to get out of sight. I scrambled up the rocks, my hands scraping against the sharp edges, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I threw myself down behind a large boulder, trying to catch my breath, praying he hadn't seen where I went. I could hear the car stop nearby, the engine idling. I held my breath, my body shaking with fear. The silence dragged on, and I could hear the crunch of footsteps on gravel. He was looking for me. I pressed myself against the rock, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps got closer, and I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified that he would find me. He was so close, I could hear him breathing, hear the gravel shift under his weight. But then he stopped. I didn't move, didn't dare to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I heard him mutter something under his breath, and then the footsteps retreated. The car door slammed, and the engine revved as he drove off. I waited, afraid to believe it was over. I stayed hidden behind that boulder until I couldn't hear the car anymore, until the silence of the desert was all that surrounded me. Only then did I let myself breathe again. I knew I couldn't stay there, though. I needed to find help, find a way out of this nightmare. But as I got up and started walking again, every shadow seemed like a threat, every noise made me jump. The road was still empty, stretching out endlessly in front of me, and I felt so alone. It took hours of walking before I finally saw headlights in the distance, and this time, it wasn't the same car. A pickup truck slowed down as it approached, and I waved my arms, desperate for help. The driver rolled down the window, an older man with kind eyes, asking if I needed a ride. I hesitated for just a second before climbing in. As we drove away, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that car coming after me again. But it never did. I rented a cabin in North Carolina for the weekend, just a little getaway from the city. It was this cozy place tucked into the woods, not too far from Asheville. The pictures online looked great, and the host had good reviews, so I booked it without much thought. When I arrived, it was just as advertised: quiet, peaceful, surrounded by trees. The perfect escape. The host, a man in his late 40s, met me when I arrived. He seemed nice enough, maybe a bit too friendly, but nothing that set off alarm bells. He showed me around the cabin, pointing out the fireplace, the deck, and where to find extra towels. He mentioned that he lived nearby, just up the road if I needed anything. I nodded along, eager to settle in and enjoy the solitude. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, watched a movie, and eventually fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping on the roof. It was relaxing, exactly what I needed. But the next day, things started to feel off. I woke up late and decided to explore the cabin a bit more. It had this old charm to it, with creaky floors and heavy wooden furniture. As I wandered around, I noticed a small door near the back of the bedroom. It was low to the ground, almost like a crawl space, and painted the same color as the walls. I hadn't noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of me, so I tried the handle. It was locked. That struck me as strange. Why would a door inside a rental be locked? I figured it was probably just storage or something, but it nodded me all day. That evening, as the rain picked up again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cabin felt different, less inviting. I kept glancing at that hidden door, imagining what could be behind it. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was inside. I searched the cabin for a key, thinking maybe the host had left one somewhere, but no lock. Then I noticed a small gap between the door and the frame. I used a butter knife to pry it open, and after some effort, the lock gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I grabbed my phone for light and started down the stairs. The air grew colder as I descended, and the smell of dampness hit me. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of old photo albums. My heart pounded as I pulled one down and opened it. The first few pages were filled with pictures of people, couples, families, all smiling in various rooms of the cabin. They looked like normal vacation photos at first, but then I noticed something strange. The angles were all wrong, like they were taken through a crack in the wall or a hole in the ceiling. None of the people in the photos seemed to know they were being watched. I flipped through more pages, and the photos got worse. People sleeping, people changing clothes, all completely unaware they were being photographed. My hands started to shake. I recognized some of the rooms in the cabin, the bedroom, the bathroom. My stomach churned as I realized I could have been photographed too. I wanted to leave right then, but I couldn't tear myself away. I opened another album, and this one was even more disturbing. The people in these photos looked frightened, like they knew they were being watched but couldn't figure out how. Their eyes were wide, glancing around the room, searching for the source of their unease. Some of the photos showed them trying to cover windows or block doors. And then, towards the end of the album, there were pictures of them leaving the cabin in a hurry, their faces pale with fear. I slammed the album shut, my mind racing. I had to get out. I stumbled back up the stairs, my breath coming in short gasps. When I reached the bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door was closed. I was sure I had left it open. I rushed to the front door, desperate to leave, but when I yanked it open, the host was standing there. He had this calm, almost serene expression on his face, like he knew exactly what I had found. Going somewhere, he asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. I stammered something about needing to leave, but he didn't move. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, his eyes fixed on me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, feel the pressure of the situation closing in around me. I noticed the door was open, he said, his tone light, like we were discussing the weather. That door is supposed to stay locked, you know. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to stay calm, tried to think of a way out, but he didn't give me much time. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said quietly. "It's private." I backed away, my mind racing for an escape. The cabin suddenly felt small, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me as I realized I was trapped. "I think you should leave," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "Now?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think that's going to happen." In a flash, I darted past him, shoving him aside with all the strength I had. He stumbled, caught off guard, and I yanked the door open again. I didn't look back as I ran out into the rain, sprinting down the muddy path towards my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and finally managed to unlock the door. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped off without a second thought. I was driving late at night on a highway in Colorado. It was a long stretch of road, nothing but darkness and the occasional sign telling me how far away the next town was. I had been on the road for hours, trying to make it to my destination before morning. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional gust of wind against the car. I hadn't seen another car in miles. It was just me and the road. The sky was pitch black, no moon, no stars. Just the beam of my headlights cutting through the darkness. I was tired, but I had to keep going. Stopping on a deserted highway in the middle of nowhere didn't seem like a good idea. Then I noticed something in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just a faint glow far off in the distance. I thought it was another car, maybe someone else traveling late at night like me. But as the glow got closer, I realized the car's headlights were off. It was just a dark shape, barely visible in the mirror. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was someone who forgot to turn their lights on. But as it got closer, a feeling of unease crept over me. Why would someone be driving with their lights off on a road like this, so late at night? I tried to ignore it and kept driving, hoping they would just pass me by. But the car didn't pass. It stayed behind me, close enough that I could feel it, but far enough that I couldn't see it clearly. The headlights still weren't on. I pressed down on the gas, speeding up a little, thinking maybe they'd take the hint and go around me. But when I sped up, so did they. The distance between us stayed the same, always just out of sight. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. Something wasn't right. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass, but the car slowed down too, matching my speed exactly. It was like they were toying with me, staying just behind, never revealing themselves. My heart started to race. I didn't know what to do. There was no one else on the road, no place to stop, no way to get help. It was just me and this car that seemed to be playing some kind of sick game. I tried to stay calm, but every time I looked in the mirror, that dark shape was there, following me, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was driving the car wasn't just messing around. They had a purpose, and it wasn't good. I took a deep breath and decided to try something else. I eased off the gas, letting the car slow down gradually, almost to a crawl. Maybe they'd get bored and leave me alone. But they didn't. The car behind me slowed down too, keeping the same distance, always just out of sight. I felt trapped. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen next. I considered pulling over, but the thought of stopping on the side of the road with that car behind me made my skin crawl. I had to keep moving, but I didn't know where to go. Then, without warning, the car behind me sped up. It came closer, so close I could almost see the outline of it in my mirror. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed the gas pedal, trying to put some distance between us. But it was too late. The car pulled up alongside me, its headlights still off. I glanced over, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. My pulse was racing. I had no idea what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. Then they swerved towards me, forcing me towards the shoulder. My tires screeched as I fought to keep control of the car. The other car swerved again, and I felt my car lurch to the side. Panic set in. I couldn't outrun them, couldn't get away. They were trying to run me off the road. I tried to stay calm, tried to keep the car steady, but they were relentless. Every time I corrected, they swerved again, pushing me closer and closer to the edge. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. Then, with one final swerve, they forced me off the road. My car spun out of control, skidding across the shoulder and into the dirt. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car came to a stop, half off the road, dust and gravel flying everywhere. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. I looked in the mirror, expecting to see the other car, but they were gone. Just vanished into the night like they were never there. I didn't waste any time. I put the car in gear and got back on the road, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the next town. I checked into the motel late, exhausted from the drive. It was one of those places you only stop at because you've been on the road too long, and it's the only option for miles. The neon sign flickered as I pulled into the gravel lot, and the building looked worn down, like it hadn't been updated in decades. But I didn't care. I just needed a bed for the night. The guy at the front desk barely looked up when I asked for a room. He handed me a key without a word, just nodded towards the hallway. The place smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet was worn thin. I walked to my room, number 8, at the end of the hall. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room wasn't much better. The bedspread was faded, the curtains barely hanging on their rods, and there was a draft coming from the window. But it was quiet, and that was enough. I set my bag on the chair and looked around. That's when I noticed the scratches. They were on the wall by the bed, thin, jagged lines that ran down towards the floor. At first, I thought maybe someone had moved the furniture and scraped the wall. But as I looked closer, I saw the scratches weren't just on the wall. They were on the dresser too, deep gouges in the wood, like someone had dragged something sharp across it. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I brushed it off. Old motels like this one probably saw all kinds of rough use. People didn't care about keeping things nice when they were just passing through. I told myself it was nothing and tried to forget about it. I took a shower, the water lukewarm and the pressure barely enough to rinse the soap off. When I got out, I noticed the mirror was fogged up. I wiped it with my hand and saw more scratches on the bathroom door, long and deep. I stared at them for a moment, trying to figure out what could have made them. But again, I pushed it out of my mind. I was too tired to care. I crawled into bed, the sheets stiff and smelling faintly of bleach. I turned off the light and lay there in the dark, listening to the wind outside. The scratches bothered me, though. I couldn't stop thinking about them. They didn't seem random. They felt deliberate, like someone had been in that room, angry or desperate, and they'd taken it out on the walls and furniture. I tried to fall asleep, but I kept hearing noises. A faint creaking, like someone was walking around outside my door. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but the sound kept coming back, soft but persistent. Then there was a faint tap, tap, tap on the wall. I sat up, listening. It was probably just the wind, I told myself again. But it didn't sound like the wind. I got up to check the door, making sure it was locked. As I was about to go back to bed, I noticed something under the bed. It was a book, tucked halfway beneath the frame. Curious, I pulled it out. It was an old, beat-up diary, the cover worn and the pages yellowed. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to open it. The first few pages were normal, entries from someone passing through, talking about their trip. But as I flipped through, the tone changed. The writing became frantic, the sentences short and choppy. The entries talked about strange things happening in the room. Scratches appearing on the walls, things moving on their own, a constant feeling of being watched. One entry caught my eye. It warned about staying in room 8. The writer mentioned hearing footsteps at night, seeing shadows move across the walls. They wrote that they tried to leave, but every time they opened the door, they found it locked, even when it wasn't. The last entry was scribbled, barely legible. It said, "If you find this, leave now." My heart raced as I read those words. I glanced around the room, feeling suddenly exposed. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, something someone had written to mess with the next guest. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt real. I shoved the diary back under the bed and grabbed my bag. I wasn't going to stay in that room another minute. I headed for the door, but when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. My stomach dropped. I twisted the knob harder, pulling and pushing, but it didn't budge. The door was stuck. Panic set in. I banged on the door, yelling for help, but no one answered. The wind held outside, but inside it was dead quiet. Too quiet. I turned around, my back pressed to the door, and scanned the room. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the corners, creeping closer. I could hear the tapping sound again, faint but steady, like something was scratching at the walls. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room. The wind outside picked up, making the window rattle. But inside, it was stifling, the air thick with tension. I looked at the window, thinking maybe I could get out that way. But when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge either. The frame was warped, the glass dirty, and smeared with something I couldn't identify. I was trapped. I tried the door again, pulling with all my strength, but it stayed locked. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what to do. The scratches on the wall seemed to mock me, a reminder that I wasn't the first person to feel this way in that room. Then I heard footsteps outside the door. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone was pacing back and forth. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. There was a knock, soft at first, then louder. I didn't answer. The knock came again, more insistent. I pressed myself against the wall, away from the door, my eyes wide with fear. I didn't know who or what was on the other side, but I didn't want to find out. The knock stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard the door creak, like someone was trying to handle from the outside. My heart raced as I watched the knob twist slowly, then stop. Whoever was out there couldn't get in, just like I couldn't get out. I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting for them to leave. But the footsteps didn't move away. They stayed right outside the door, pacing back and forth, waiting. I felt trapped, helpless. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing closer, the scratches digging into my mind. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually the footsteps faded and the room was silent again. I waited, too scared to move, until I finally gathered the courage to try the door one last time. This time, the handle turned and the door swung open. I didn't wait to see what was out there. I grabbed my bag and bolted down the hall, not stopping until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. I didn't look back as I sped away, the motel fading into the night behind me. To this day, I can still feel the weight of that room, the scratches etched into my memory. I don't know who or what was in there before me, but I'm just glad I got out. I checked into the hotel late, just past midnight. My flight had been delayed, and I was exhausted. The airport was only a few minutes away, and this hotel was the closest option. The lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when the night has settled in and everyone else is already asleep. The receptionist barely looked at me as she handed me the key card. She muttered something about breakfast hours, but I wasn't paying attention. I just wanted to get to my room, take a shower, and crash for the night. When I got to the room, I swiped the key card and pushed the door open. The lights were dim, and the room had that standard, impersonal hotel feel. Bed, desk, TV on the wall. The air conditioner hummed quietly, and the smell of stale air lingered. I noticed the suitcase almost immediately. It was sitting in the corner, near the window, half hidden by the curtain. My first thought was that the hotel had given me a room that was still occupied. I hesitated, wondering if I should go back to the front desk and ask for another room. But then I looked around more carefully. The bed was made, towels were neatly folded on the bathroom counter. There was no sign of anyone else having been in there recently. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the suitcase and crouched down. It was an old, beat-up thing, black with scuffed edges. The zipper was half undone, like someone had been in a hurry when they closed it. My hand hovered over it for a moment before I finally pulled the zipper all the way open. Inside, there were stacks of cash. Neat, orderly piles of bills, all bound with rubber bands. I froze, staring at it. There had to be tens of thousands of dollars in there. My mind raced. What the hell was this doing in my room? And then I saw the note. It was just a small, folded piece of paper tucked between the bills. My hands were shaking as I opened it. It was a simple message, delivered to 1029 Cypress Avenue. Do not contact anyone. You have until 2 a.m. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was 12:45 a.m. The address was only a few miles away, but that didn't give me much time. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to take the money and run, but the rest of me knew that whoever left this here wouldn't let me get away that easily. I sat down on the bed, staring at the suitcase. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of a plane taking off. My thoughts were jumbled, a mix of fear and confusion. Why me? Why this room? Before I could make a decision, there was a knock on the door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed quiet, whoever it was would go away. But the knock came again, louder this time. My stomach twisted in knots. I stood up, moving towards the door as quietly as I could. I peered through the peephole. There was a man standing on the other side. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, his face hidden in the shadow cast by the hallway light. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel the tension in the way he stood, like he was ready to force his way in. I backed away from the door. The knocking became more insistent, a pounding that echoed through the room. Whoever this was, they weren't going to leave. My mind raced. I could call the front desk, but what would I say? That there was a man in my door, and I found a suitcase full of money in my room? They wouldn't believe me. And even if they did, that man outside wouldn't just disappear because I asked for help. I looked around the room, trying to think of another way out. The window. I rushed over and pulled the curtain aside. I was on the second floor, but there was an emergency staircase just a few feet away. I could make it if I was fast. The pounding on the door grew louder, more desperate. I grabbed the suitcase without thinking, slung it over my shoulder, and unlocked the window. The night air hit me like a shock, cold and sharp. I crawled out onto the metal platform, my heart racing. As I climbed down the steps, I heard the door to my room burst open. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept going, my feet hitting the ground harder with each step. The suitcase was heavy, weighing me down, but I didn't dare leave it behind. I hit the pavement and ran. The hotel parking lot was empty, just rows of darkened cars. My own car was parked on the far side, and I made a beeline for it. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast and determined. They were catching up. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. I could feel the man getting closer, his footsteps echoing off the pavement. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw the suitcase into the passenger seat and jumped in, slamming the door shut just as the man reached for me. I didn't look at him as I sped out of the lot, tires screeching on the asphalt. I could see him in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was miles from the hotel, my hands gripping the steering, while so tightly my knuckles turned white. I pulled over in a deserted parking lot, my breath coming in like it gasps. The suitcase was still sitting on the seat next to me, the note crumpled on top of it. I didn't know what to do. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. You have 1 hour left. Don't be late. I sat there for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I knew I had no choice. I couldn't run, couldn't hide. Whoever these people were, they wouldn't let me get away. I started the car again and headed for Cypress Avenue, the suitcase sitting heavy in the seat next to me. The streets were dark and empty, the city asleep around me. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. Every car that passed made my heart race. When I finally reached 1029 Cypress Avenue, it was a rundown warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. My phone buzzed again. Leave the suitcase at the door. Walk away. I did as I was told. The suitcase felt even heavier as I carried it to the door. I set it down, took one last look at the building, and turned to leave. As I walked back to my car, I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The car door felt like a lifeline as I climbed in and drove away. By the time I made it back to the airport, the sun was starting to rise. I returned my rental car, boarded the first flight out of town, and never looked back. I moved into the apartment in Georgia because it was cheap and I needed a place fast. The landlord seemed friendly enough when I met him. He was in his 50s, maybe older, with graying hair and a tired face. He didn't say much, just handed me the keys and told me to let him know if I needed anything. At first, everything was fine. The apartment was small but cozy. The walls were thin and I could hear my neighbors sometimes, but I figured that was normal. I kept to myself, unpacked my things, and tried to settle in. But then I started noticing strange things. Small things at first. The door to my apartment would be unlocked when I came home, even though I was sure I locked it. I thought maybe I was just forgetting. Sometimes my stuff would be in a different spot than where I left it. A book on the table, a dish in the sink. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just stressed from the move. Then I started seeing the landlord more often. He would be outside when I left for work, just standing there staring. Sometimes, when I came home, I'd see him near the entrance to the building, just watching me. He never said anything, just looked at me with that tired, empty expression. One night, I heard footsteps outside my door. It was late, maybe around 2 a.m. I was lying in bed, half asleep, and I could hear someone walking in the hallway. The footsteps stopped right in front of my door. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard the doorknob rattle, like someone was trying to open it. I froze. The door didn't open, but I could hear breathing on the other side. Slow, heavy breathing. I waited, terrified, until the footsteps finally moved away. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I called the landlord and told him about it. He acted like it was no big deal. He said maybe it was someone from another apartment, but I knew it wasn't. The way he said it, so casually, made my skin crawl. After that, I started locking the door with the deadbolt every time I left. But the strange things kept happening. My food would be missing from the fridge. My clothes would be messed with. I knew someone was coming into my apartment when I wasn't there. I decided to install a camera. I found a small, cheap one online that I could hide on a shelf in my bedroom. I set it up so it would record whenever there was movement. I wanted to catch whoever was sneaking into my place. The first few days, there was nothing on the footage. Just me coming and going, getting ready for bed, watching TV. I started to think maybe I was just paranoid that there was no one coming in after all. But then one night, I came home from work and found the door unlocked again. I knew I had locked it when I left that morning. My heart was racing as I checked the camera footage. At first, everything seemed normal. The camera recorded me leaving in the morning, locking the door behind me. The apartment was empty for hours. Then, around noon, the footage showed the door opening. The landlord walked in like he owned the place. He didn't even hesitate. He walked straight into my bedroom and started going through my things. He opened drawers, looked under the bed, even checked the bathroom. He moved around like he'd done it 100 times before. I was shaking as I watched. I wanted to turn it off, but I couldn't look away. The footage showed him spending at least 20 minutes in my apartment, just looking through my stuff. Then he left, locking the door behind him. But it wasn't over. That night, after I went to bed, the camera recorded movement again. I was asleep, lying on my side, facing the wall. The door to my bedroom opened slowly, and the landlord stepped inside. He moved so quietly, like he didn't want to wake me. He just stood there, at the foot of my bed, staring down at me. The footage showed him standing there for what felt like forever, just watching me sleep. My breath caught in my throat as I watched. I could see myself on the screen, completely unaware, vulnerable. And there he was, just inches away. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He leaned down, so close that his face was just above mine, and he whispered something. I couldn't hear it on the footage, but I could see his lips moving. Then he reached out, like he was going to touch me, but he pulled back at the last second. He left the room, but not before looking back one last time. The camera showed him closing the door behind him, and everything went dark again. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to stay, but I had nowhere else to go. I couldn't confront him. I didn't even want to think about what he might do if he knew I had recorded him. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I went to a friend's place and told her everything. She helped me contact the police. They took the footage and said they'd investigate, but I never went back to that apartment. I couldn't. I don't know what happened to the landlord. I don't want to know. All I know is that I got out, and I'm never staying in a place like that again. I was on the bus, heading back home late at night. It was one of those long rides across New Mexico, with nothing but desert stretching out on either side of the highway. The bus was almost empty, just me and one other guy sitting a few rows ahead. He looked like he had been on the bus for a while, slouched in his seat, a hood pulled low over his face. I didn't pay much attention to him at first. I just wanted to get home and sleep. But after a while, I started to notice that he kept turning around to look at me. Not a quick glance, either. He would stare at me for a few seconds before turning back around. At first, I thought maybe he was just restless, like he couldn't sleep. But then it kept happening. Every few minutes, he'd turn around and look at me. It started to make me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the view outside the window. But there wasn't much to see out there, just darkness and the occasional faint glow from a distant town. The bus rumbled along, the sound of the tires on the road the only noise. I glanced up again, and there he was, staring right at me. This time, he didn't look away when I caught him. That's when I started to feel nervous. I shifted in my seat, trying to decide if I should move or say something. But where would I go? The bus was nearly empty, and moving closer to the front would just put me further away from the driver. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just weird, or maybe he thought he recognized me from somewhere. But then he got up. Slowly, like he was trying not to draw attention, he stood up and started walking toward the back of the bus. Toward me. My heart started pounding. I tried to keep calm, thinking maybe he was just going to the bathroom or something. But he wasn't. He stopped right next to my seat and stood there, not saying anything, just looking down at me. I looked up at him, trying to hide how scared I was. He was taller than I expected, and up close, I could see his face better under the hood. His eyes were dark, almost lifeless, and his skin was pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in a long time. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Car problem? I finally asked, trying to sound tough, but my voice shook a little. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. A long, thin blade that glinted in the dim light of the bus. My stomach dropped. I could feel the blood draining from my face as he held the knife up, pointing it at me. "Give me your wallet," he said, his voice low and cold. For a second, I couldn't move. I was frozen in my seat, staring at the knife. Then my hands started shaking as I reached for my wallet in my pocket. I fumbled with it, nearly dropping it as I handed it over to him. He snatched it from me and flipped it open, pulling out the cash. He didn't even look at the cards or my ID, just took the money and shoved the wallet back into my chest. I thought that would be the end of it, but then he leaned in closer, the knife still pointed at me. "Phone too," he hissed. I nodded quickly, pulling my phone out of my other pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but I managed to hand it over. He took it, slipping it into his jacket without a word. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was too scared to say anything, too scared to move. Then, without warning, he stepped back, his eyes still locked on mine. He didn't put the knife away, just held it at his side, like he was waiting for me to do something. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if he was going to hurt me, or if he was done. Finally, he turned and walked back to his seat, the knife still in his hand. He sat down, and I could feel his eyes on me again. I didn't move, didn't dare look at him. I just stared straight ahead, trying to calm down, trying to think of what to do next. The bus rolled on through the darkness, and the minutes felt like hours. I kept expecting him to get up again, to come back with the knife, but he didn't. He just sat there, watching me waiting. When the bus finally pulled into the next town, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. I didn't look back to see if he followed me. I just ran off the bus, out into the night, and didn't stop until I was far away from the station. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what to do. My phone was gone, my money too. But I was alive, and that was all I cared about. I kept walking, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting him to appear out of the shadows. Eventually, I found a police station. I told them everything, and they took my statement. But they never found him. I don't know if he stayed on that bus, or if he disappeared into the night. All I know is that I never want to see his face again, never want to feel that fear again. I was on a solo road trip, driving through the middle of nowhere in Nevada. The stretch of highway seemed endless, and the landscape was barren, just miles of desert. I'd been on the road for hours, my eyes starting to blur from staring at the endless asphalt. That's when I saw the sign, a faded, weathered wooden board barely legible from the highway. It advertised an old roadside attraction up ahead. I didn't have anywhere to be until the evening, so I figured it might be interesting to take a break, stretch my legs, and see what was left of the place. I turned off the highway and followed the dirt road that led to the attraction. It was a long, bumpy ride, with dust kicking up behind my car. After a few minutes, I reached a small, deserted parking lot. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The main building, once painted a bright red, was now chipped and peeling. A few smaller structures were scattered around, all in various stages of decay. Rusty signs advertised attractions that no longer existed. See the two-headed snake and world's largest ball of twine. I got out of the car and looked around. It was eerily quiet, not even a breeze to break the silence. The sun was high in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the broken pavement. I grabbed my water bottle from the car and started walking toward the main building. The front door was hanging off its hinges, barely attached. I hesitated for a second before pushing it open, stepping inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside. Dust covered everything, and broken glass crunched under my feet. Faded posters lined the walls, advertising long-forgotten attractions. There was a counter at the back of the room, where they must have sold tickets and souvenirs. I wandered around, taking in the remnants of what must have once been a bustling tourist trap. Now it was nothing but decay and emptiness. As I walked deeper into the building, I thought I heard something, a soft shuffle, like someone moving quietly. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen, but all I heard was silence. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal or the wind. I continued exploring, pushing open a door that led to a back room. Inside, there were old crates stacked against the walls, filled with dusty trinkets and souvenirs that no one had bothered to take when the place closed down. That's when I heard it again, a faint rustling sound, coming from somewhere nearby. I froze, my heart starting to pound in my chest. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate, like someone trying to stay hidden. I turned around slowly, scanning the room, but I didn't see anyone. I took a deep breath and told myself I was being paranoid. It was an old building, probably full of creaking wood and shifting debris, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I left the back room and stepped outside, into the bright sunlight. The sudden change in light made me squint, and for a moment, I felt disoriented. I looked around a lot, trying to spot anything unusual, but everything seemed still, just like before. I decided to check out one of the smaller buildings, a rundown shack off to the side. As I walked over, I glanced back at my car, making sure it was still in sight. The shack was even more dilapidated than the main building, the door barely hanging on by one hinge. I pushed it open with my foot, wincing as the wood groaned under the pressure. Inside, it was dark and smelled like mildew. The small windows were covered in grime, letting in only slivers of light. There were more old crates and broken furniture piled up in the corners. I stepped inside cautiously, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. And then I heard it again, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of someone moving, their foot scraping against the floor. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, my heart racing. I still couldn't see anyone, but the noise was too clear to ignore now. Someone was here with me, hiding, watching. I backed up slowly, my eyes darting around the room. That's when I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner, just a flash, like someone ducking behind one of the crates. I swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't know if it was just some drifter looking for a place to sleep, or if it was something worse. I decided to get out of there. I turned and headed for the door, trying not to make any sudden movements. But as I reached the doorway, I heard the sound again, footsteps, quick and purposeful, coming right toward me. I bolted out of the shack and back into the open air, my heart pounding so hard I could barely think. I looked around frantically, trying to spot whoever was following me, but the lot was empty. I ran back toward the main building, hoping to find a place to hide, or maybe a weapon, anything to protect myself. As I reached the entrance, I glanced back one more time, and that's when I saw him. A man, tall and thin, was standing just outside the shack, watching me. He was wearing old, dirty clothes, and his face was partially obscured by a hat. But I could see his eyes, cold and dark, fixed on me. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there, watching, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I felt a surge of panic and rushed into the main building, slamming the door behind me. I looked around, trying to find something, anything to defend myself with. My eyes landed on a rusty metal pipe lying on the floor, and I grabbed it, gripping it tightly in my hands. I listened, my breath coming in short gasps. I could hear footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming closer. The door creaked open, and I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, the pipe raised and ready. I could see his shadow through the crack in the door, and I knew he was just on the other side. He stepped inside, and I swung the pipe with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man let out a grunt, stumbling back. I didn't wait to see if he was hurt. I dropped the pipe and ran, sprinting out of the building and across the lot to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and throw myself inside. I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing in the middle of the lot, watching me drive away. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me, following me as I disappeared down the road. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway, miles away from that place. I was staying in Boston for a work conference, and decided to take a quick walk to clear my head. It was late, and the city streets were mostly empty. I was heading back to my hotel when I noticed a shortcut, a pedestrian tunnel that ran under the street. It seemed like a good idea to cut through and save a few minutes. The tunnel was dimly lit with flickering lights. The concrete walls were grimy, and the air felt damp. I walked through the tunnel, my footsteps echoing softly off the walls. It was quiet, except for the occasional drip of water somewhere in the darkness. About halfway through, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but the tunnel was empty. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just someone else using the tunnel. I continued walking, but the footsteps started again. They were faint at first, but they seemed to be getting closer. I sped up, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The footsteps followed suit, quickening their pace. I glanced back once more, but still saw no one. The tunnel's lights made eerie shadows on the walls, making it hard to see clearly. Panic started to set in. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I quickened my pace even more, almost breaking into a jog. The footsteps behind me kept getting louder and closer, almost like they were right on my heels. I stopped and turned around sharply, my breath coming in short gasps. But again, there was no one there. I shined my phone's flashlight behind me, the beam cutting through the darkness. I saw nothing but the empty, concrete tunnel stretching out behind me. I felt a surge of fear. It was unsettling to know someone was there, but not be able to see them. I started walking again, my steps echoing louder as I tried to get to the end of the tunnel. Then I heard something else, soft, irregular breathing. It was coming from behind me, barely audible but unmistakable. I froze, my mind racing. The sound was closer now, like someone was just out of sight, following me silently. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I started walking faster, my footsteps now a frantic pounding. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to stay calm, thinking if I just made it to the end, I would be safe. I looked ahead, trying to see the exit, but the end of the tunnel seemed far off, shrouded in shadows. I turned around one last time, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark. For a split second, I saw a shadow moving quickly. It was a person, or at least a figure, darting back out of the beam of light. My heart raced even faster. I ran the rest of the way, my lungs burning with the effort. I reached the end of the tunnel and burst out into the street. I looked back, expecting to see someone following me, but the tunnel was empty. The street was quiet and desolate, with only a few distant lights casting long shadows. I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the adrenaline. I didn't wait around. I hurried back to my hotel, taking the long route to avoid the tunnel. The streets felt safer, even though they were just as empty. I was relieved to finally reach my hotel room, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept imagining the footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, but the fear didn't go away. I didn't use that shortcut again, and made sure to stay in well-lit, populated areas for the rest of my trip. I was working late at my downtown Chicago apartment, trying to finish up some reports. The city outside was quiet, and I was focused on my screen. Around midnight, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from near my front door. I paused, listening carefully, but couldn't hear anything else. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe a stray cat. I tried to push it out of my mind, and went back to work. A few minutes later, I heard a louder noise. It was unmistakably the sound of my door being forced open. My heart raced as I realized someone was breaking in. I grabbed my laptop and shut it down, the soft hum of the computer stopping abruptly. I turned off all the lights, plunging the apartment into darkness. I rushed to my bedroom and quickly hid in the closet. My breathing was heavy, and I had to force myself to stay quiet. I could hear footsteps moving around the apartment, getting louder as they approached. The sound of furniture being knocked over and drawers being pulled open filled the space. The closet door had slats that let me see out into the room, but I had to stay perfectly still. I watched as two men came into view. They were wearing masks, so I couldn't see their faces. They moved with purpose, tossing aside books and rifling through drawers. I could hear their low, gruff voices as they talked to each other, discussing what they were looking for. My phone was on the coffee table in the living room, just a few feet away from where the men were searching. I needed to find a way to call for help, but I couldn't risk making any noise. I felt a wave of panic as I considered my options. If I tried to sneak out, they might hear me and catch me in the act. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. One of the intruders walked over to the coffee table and picked up my phone. My heart sank as I realized he was holding it, examining it. I could see the screen lighting up briefly, probably because of a notification. He put it back down, and I let out a quiet sigh of relief. But my situation was still dire. The men continued to search the apartment, and their conversation became more heated. They were clearly frustrated that they couldn't find what they were looking for. I overheard them mention something about a safe, and how they had been told it was here. I didn't have a safe, but it was clear they were convinced they had the right place. I knew I had to act quickly. I reached into the closet and found a small box of old office supplies. I took a deep breath and decided to use one of the pens from the box. I quietly unscrewed the pen and took out the spring inside. Using the spring and a piece of string from the box, I tried to make a makeshift signal. It wasn't much, but if I could throw it close enough to the phone, maybe I could use the vibration to attract attention. I carefully and quietly threw the spring and string towards the living room. It landed with a soft thud on the carpet. I held my breath, hoping it would make enough noise to alert the intruders, but not so much that it would make them suspicious. The men were still arguing about the safe, and I heard one of them curse loudly in frustration. After a tense few minutes, one of the men noticed the string and picked it up. I watched as he examined it, clearly puzzled. He seemed to lose interest quickly and tossed it aside. I was back to square one, but I couldn't give up. I needed to find another way. I noticed that the men were starting to get more desperate. Their search was becoming more frantic, and they were now overturning furniture. I decided to try another tactic. I slowly moved to the edge of the closet and looked for something I could use as a distraction. I spotted an old alarm clock on the shelf above me. I grabbed the alarm clock and, with great care, set the time to ring in a few minutes. I then placed it on the edge of the closet, or it would fall out if I nudged it. I slowly moved it just enough so that when the clock went off, it would make a noise and hopefully draw the men's attention. The minutes ticked by slowly. My hands were clammy, and my heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. When the alarm clock finally went off, it made a loud ringing noise. The intruders stopped their search and turned towards the sound. I could see them moving quickly to the source of the noise. I took the opportunity to slowly and quietly crawl out of the closet. My heart was pounding as I tried to stay as silent as possible. I moved towards the coffee table, hoping the men would be too distracted by the noise to notice me. I reached for my phone, but my fingers fumbled and it almost slipped off the table. I grabbed it just in time and dialed 911. I kept my voice low, whispering to the operator about the situation and my location. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it could take a few minutes. I ended the call and tried to remain as quiet as possible. The men were still searching the apartment, but their movements were now more hurried. I knew I had to stay hidden until the police arrived. I crawled behind the couch and held my breath, listening to the chaos around me. Minutes felt like hours. The sounds of the men's footsteps grew more distant, and I could hear sirens approaching in the distance. The intruders finally started to leave the apartment, their voices fading away. I waited until the apartment was silent again before cautiously emerging from my hiding spot. I saw the flashing lights of police cars outside the window. I knew help had arrived. I opened the door and quickly let the officers in. They went through the apartment, checking for any remaining intruders and assessing the damage. They assured me that it was safe to come out now and started taking statements. I was shaken but relieved. The officers were thorough and checked the apartment for any signs of further tampering. They were able to catch up with the intruders later, thanks to the quick response to my call. That night was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had never imagined that a simple noise could lead to such a dangerous situation. / last night was a shift like no other. I work as a security guard in a big office building downtown. Usually it's pretty quiet. I make my rounds, check the cameras, and make sure everything is locked up. But last night, something happened that I still can't shake. It was around 1 a.m. when I got a call on the building's emergency line. It's a direct line, meant for real emergencies only. I answered it right away. A woman's voice was on the other end, trembling and scared. She said she was being held against her, somewhere in the building. I asked her where she was, trying to stay calm. She said she didn't know exactly, but described a room with no windows and a heavy door. My mind raced. I knew the building inside and out, and I couldn't think of a room like that. I told her to stay quiet, and that I would find her. I grabbed my flashlight and set out to check every floor. I started on the ground floor and worked my way up. Each floor was empty, just dark offices and locked doors. I kept the phone on me, hoping she'd call back with more information. As I reached the top floor, I felt a chill. The top floor was supposed to be empty. No businesses, no offices, just storage. But the woman's voice was so real, so desperate. I checked every storage room, but they were all empty. I went back to the security office to check the cameras. I rewound the footage, looking for anything unusual. That's when I saw something strange. On one of the cameras, I saw a shadow moving in a hallway on the top floor. It was quick, but definitely there. I headed back up, heart pounding. I checked the hallway where I saw the shadow, but there was nothing. No signs of anyone. I started to think I was imagining things, but then I heard a faint noise, like a door creaking. I followed the sound to a wall at the end of the hallway. It looked like a regular wall, but when I pressed on it, it moved. A hidden door. I couldn't believe it. I pushed it open and found a dark staircase leading down. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. At the bottom was a heavy metal door, just like the woman described. I knocked softly and called out to her. She answered right away, her voice full of relief. I told her to stand back and tried the handle. It was locked. I looked around and saw a keypad on the wall. I had no idea what the code could be. I asked her if she knew, but she said her tapters always punched it in too fast for her to see. I had to think fast. I remembered seeing a keypad in the security office with a list of default codes for emergency use. I told her I'd be right back and ran up the stairs. My legs felt like lead as I sprinted to the office. I found the list and ran back down. I tried the first code, nothing. The second, still nothing. On the third try, the door clicked open. I pushed it open and saw her, tied to a chair in the middle of the room. She looked terrified, but unarmed. I rushed to her and untied her. She thanked me over and over, tears streaming down her face. I told her we needed to get out of there before her tapters came back. We hurried up the stairs and out into the hallway. Just as we reached the main hallway, I heard voices. The tapters were coming back. I led her to a nearby office, and we hid inside, holding our breath. The voices got closer, then stopped right outside the door. I could see shadows moving under the door. They were looking for her. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. But after a few tense minutes, they moved on. We waited a bit longer, then made our way out. We got to the ground floor and out the front door. I called the police as soon as we were outside. They arrived quickly and took the woman to safety. They searched the building but didn't find the tapters. They had vanished. The police questioned me for hours. I told them everything I knew, but there were still so many questions. Who were these people? Why was she being held? And how did they know the building so well? I didn't get any answers that night. I went home, exhausted and shaken. I couldn't sleep, replaying everything in my mind. The woman's voice, the hidden door, the shadows under the door. It all felt like a nightmare. Today, I'm still trying to process it all. The building feels different now, less safe. I keep thinking about that woman and what she went through. I'm just glad I was there to help, even if I don't have all the answers. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again, but I do know one thing. I'll always trust my instincts. If I hadn't listened to that call, who knows what might have happened to her. I went out early that morning, hoping to get some quiet time on the lake. Fishing alone had always been my way of unwinding, especially after a stressful week. The weather was perfect, a light mist over the water, and not too cold. I set up my gear and cast my line, enjoying the stillness around me. After a while, I noticed another fisherman not too far from me. He was waving and smiling. I waved back politely. He started walking over, his gear slung over his shoulder. "Morning," he called out cheerfully. "Morning," I replied, trying to focus on my line. "Nice spot you got here," he said, settling down nearby. "Mind if I join you?" "Sure," I said, though I would have preferred to be alone. He introduced himself as Mark and started chatting about fishing, the weather, and other small talk. I answered politely but tapped my responses short. He seemed nice enough, but I really just wanted some peace and quiet. After a while, Mark's friendliness started to feel a bit intrusive. He kept asking questions about my life, where I lived, what I did for work. I gave fake answers, hoping he'd take the hint. "Hey, how about we try that spot over there?" he suggested, pointing to a more secluded area of the lake. "I'm good here," I said, not wanting to move. "Come on, I heard it's really good over there," he insisted. "No thanks. I think I'll stay put," I replied firmly. His friendly demeanor changed slightly. "Suit yourself," he muttered, moving a bit closer to me. I started to feel uneasy. There was something off about him. His questions became more personal, more invasive. "You always come out here alone?" he asked, his tone a bit too curious. "Usually," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a moment, then smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's nice, isn't it? Just you and nature." "Yeah," I said, glancing at my phone. I decided it was time to leave. "Well, I think I'm gonna head back," I said, starting to pack up my gear. "Already?" he asked, standing up. "The best time for fishing is just coming up." "I've got some things to do," I said, trying to sound casual. He stepped closer, blocking my path. "Stay a bit longer. It's not often you get such good company out here." I felt a surge of panic. "Really? I need to go," I insisted, my heart pounding. He grabbed my arm. I said stay, he said, his grip tightening. I yanked my arm away. "Let go of me," I snapped, backing away. His friendly mask dropped completely. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and menacing. I looked around, trying to find a way out. The path back to my car was a good distance away, and I didn't know if I could outrun him. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while I thought of a plan. He shrugged. "It's more fun with company," he said, taking a step closer. I packed up further, my mind racing. I remembered the knife in my tackle box. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, edging toward my gear. "Too late for that," he said, lunging at me. I grabbed the knife and swung it out in front of me. He stopped short, eyes wide. "Stay back," I warned, holding the knife between us. He sneered. "You think that scares me?" "Stay back," I repeated, my voice shaking. He lunged again, and I slashed at him, catching his arm. He yelled in pain, but it didn't stop him. He tackled me, knocking the knife from my hand. We struggled on the ground, and I managed to take him off me. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward my car, adrenaline giving me a burst of speed. I could hear him behind me, shouting and cursing. I didn't look back, just focused on getting to my car. I reached it and fumbled for my keys, my hand shaking. I got the door open and jumped in, locking it behind me. He pounded on the window, but I started the engine and sped off, my heart racing. I drove straight to the nearest town and went to the police station. They took my statement and sent officers to the lake, but by the time they got there, Mark was gone. I decided to go camping in a remote area of the forest for a few days of solitude and relaxation. I picked a spot far from the main trails, hoping for peace and quiet. Everything was going well until the storm hit. It started as a light drizzle, but quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The wind was howling, and the rain was pouring down. The rain was coming down so hard it felt like it might tear my tent apart. I packed up what I could and made a quick decision to find shelter. I remembered passing an old barn on the way to the campsite. It was about a half-mile away, so I grabbed my flashlight and started heading in that direction. The rain made the ground slippery, and I had to be careful not to fall. By the time I reached the barn, I was soaked through. The wind was so fierce it felt like it might blow me off my feet. I pushed the creaky door open and stepped inside. The barn was old and musty, but it was dry. I shined my flashlight around and saw some scattered hay bales and old farming equipment. At least I was out of the rain. As I settled into a corner, trying to warm up a bit, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints on the dirt floor, and the hay around them was disturbed. It looked like someone had been here recently, and not just passing through. There were also some discarded food wrappers and a couple of empty bottles. A shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't alone here, but I didn't see anyone. The storm outside was getting worse, and the sound of the wind and rain was so loud it was hard to hear anything else. I tried to stay calm and decided to wait it out until the storm passed. I kept my flashlight off to avoid drawing attention and sat very still. Every creak of the barn made me jump. The thought that someone might be hiding in here with me was making it hard to breathe. I kept listening, trying to detect any sounds that might hint at someone else's presence. The storm raged on, and it felt like the wind was getting even stronger. I heard a loud bang outside, and my heart nearly stopped. I looked around the barn, searching for any possible weapons or ways to defend myself. The only thing I could find was a rusty pitchfork, which I picked up and held close, hoping it would be enough if I needed it. The barn door creaked open, and I froze. I was sure I had closed it properly. I quietly moved to a spot where I could see the door without being seen myself. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside. My breath caught in my throat. They were looking inside, but they didn't come in right away. I held my flashlight tightly, ready to use it if necessary. The figure stayed outside for what felt like an eternity, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. The rain was still pouring down, and the storm's fury seemed to be increasing. Finally, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I waited for what felt like another hour before I dared to move. The storm had let up a bit, and I thought maybe it was safe to leave. I carefully made my way to the door, peeking outside. The rain was still coming down, but the wind had calmed slightly. I couldn't see anyone, but I didn't want to take any chances. I decided to go back to my campsite and pack up as quickly as possible. I figured it would be safer to leave the area rather than risk running into whoever had been in the barn. I grabbed my things and headed out, trying to avoid the muddy patches that might make me slip. The path back to my campsite was treacherous. The storm had made the trail almost impassable. I slipped a few times but managed to keep my balance. When I finally reached my campsite, I was relieved to find that my tent was still standing, though it was soaked. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, knowing that the storm was still unpredictable. I felt a sense of urgency. The sooner I could get out of here, the better. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps nearby. I froze, my heart racing. I could see the figure of someone moving through the trees, and it wasn't far from my campsite. I hurriedly finished packing and decided to take a different route out, hoping to avoid the person who might be looking for me. I moved quickly but carefully, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The rain was still heavy, and the sound of it on the leaves masked my movement somewhat. When I finally reached my car, I was exhausted and drenched. I threw my wet gear into the back seat and started the engine, eager to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't see anyone following me. I took one last look at the forest before turning onto the main road and heading home. The storm eventually passed, and the sun came up the next day, but the fear of that night stayed with me. It was a night like any other, except for the relentless rain hammering against my windows. I was working late in my home office, trying to finish up a project that had me behind schedule. The storm outside was so loud that it drowned out everything else, making it hard to focus. The occasional flash of lightning would light up the room, only to be swallowed by darkness again. Around midnight, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but I was expecting a call from a client, so I picked it up. The voice on the other end was rough, almost like it was distorted by static. "Jenna," the voice said, "I know what you did." My heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, then the voice said, "You don't need to play dumb. You know exactly what I'm talking about." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had no idea who this person was or what they were referring to. "I think you've got the wrong number," I said. The voice laughed a harsh, mocking sound. "Don't play games with me. I know about the emails you've been sending. I know about your secret meetings." I hadn't been sending any emails I shouldn't have. And as for secret meetings, there were none. I felt a growing panic. "Listen, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to hang up now." Before I could, the call ended. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. I felt uneasy, but tried to push it aside. Maybe it was just a prank. But then the calls kept coming. Every time I answered, the caller would say something that made no sense or repeated vague threats. They knew details about my life, my job, my routines, even the names of a few friends. It was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to trace the calls, but the number always came up as blocked or unavailable. My attempts to block the number didn't work. They just kept calling from different ones. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. After an hour of this, I noticed something odd. Every now and then, I'd see a shadow moving past the window when the lightning flashed. I tried to dismiss it as the effect of the rain or my imagination. But as the night dragged on, the feeling of dread only intensified. I decided to check outside. I carefully peeked out through the curtains, trying not to draw attention. The rain was coming down in sheets, and visibility was almost zero. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that someone was out there, hiding in the dark, was almost palpable. I went back inside, trying to calm myself. I locked all the doors and windows, and the calls continued. The caller seemed to be enjoying my fear, taunting me with personal details and telling me that my time was running out. I knew I had to do something. I called the police, but they told me to stay on the line and keep them updated if anything happened. They said they'd send someone over as soon as they could, but it might take a while given the storm. I felt alone, stranded, and vulnerable. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the back of the house. I jumped, my heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat I kept for protection. The power flickered, and I knew the storm was causing disruptions. I went to the back door, shining the flashlight outside. The rain was coming down so hard that it was difficult to see anything. I carefully opened the door and stepped out, the mud squishing beneath my shoes. The backyard was empty, but I noticed a set of muddy footprints leading from the edge of the yard to the back door. They looked fresh, and the sight made my blood run cold. I quickly went back inside, locked the door, and called the police again, telling them about the footprints. They promised someone would be there soon. I sat in my office, waiting, the fear making it hard to concentrate. The calls had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I felt like a sitting duck, waiting for something terrible to happen. After what felt like hours, there was a knock on the door. I hesitated but finally opened it to find 2 police officers standing there, soaked from the rain. They came in and began to investigate, checking around the property and asking me about the calls and any suspicious activity. As they spoke with me, I felt a bit of relief, but the dread never fully left. They did a thorough search of the area, but found no one. They took the details of the calls and the muddy footprints and promised to keep an eye on things. Once they left, I locked up the house and tried to get some sleep. I left a light on and stayed close to my phone, ready to call for help if needed. The storm continued to rage outside, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the sun was out. The police had not reported any incidents from the night before. The unsettling feeling of being watched began to fade, but I knew I'd be more cautious from now on. The calls eventually stopped, and I never heard from the mysterious caller again. I was driving alone on a long stretch of highway. The rain started coming down harder, making it difficult to see. The windshield wipers were going full speed, but it didn't seem to help much. The road was nearly deserted, and I felt a bit uneasy. It was the kind of night that made you wish you weren't alone. I saw a figure on the side of the road, drenched and holding out a thumb. Normally, I wouldn't pick up a hitchhiker, but the weather was awful, and I felt a pang of sympathy. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He smiled, his face partly hidden by the hood of his jacket. "Yes, please. It's miserable out here." He climbed in, bringing a wave of cold, wet air with him. I turned up the heat and started driving again. We exchanged small talk at first. His name was Mike. He seemed friendly enough, talking about the weather and his bad luck with his car breaking down. I felt more relaxed with him in the car, the company breaking the monotony of the drive. But as the rain got heavier, something in his demeanor changed. His responses became shorter, his tone more serious. I tried to keep the conversation going, but it felt forced. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Suddenly, he reached over and locked the car doors. I glanced at him, my heart starting to race. "Why did you do that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "For safety," he replied, but there was something unsettling in his voice. He turned to face me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Keep driving." Fear gripped me. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He pulled a knife from his jacket and held it up where I could see it. "Just keep driving," he said calmly. "And don't do anything stupid." My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The rain was pounding on the roof, the road a blur in the headlights. I had to stay calm, had to think. "Where are we going?" I asked, hoping to buy some time. "There's a rest area a few miles up the road." "Pull in there," he ordered. I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. The rest area wasn't far, and I had to find a way to escape before we got there. I kept glancing at the road, looking for any opportunity. The rain made it hard to see, but I noticed a small dirt road coming up on the right. Without warning, I yanked the wheel and turned onto the dirt road. The car skidded in the mud, and Mike cursed, grabbing the dashboard for support. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. I didn't answer. I just kept driving, the car bouncing and sliding on the rough road. I could hear him fumbling with the knife, trying to steady himself. The dirt road wound through the trees, and I hoped it would lead to somewhere safe. "Stop the car," he demanded, his voice full of anger. He lunged at me, and I swerved, trying to throw him off balance. The knife grazed my arm, and I cried out in pain. I slammed on the brakes, the car sliding to a stop. I grabbed my bleeding arm and looked at him. He was panting, the knife still in his hand. "Get out," he ordered, pointing the knife at me. I didn't move. "Please, just let me go," I pleaded. He shook his head. "Get out," he repeated more forcefully. I slowly opened the door and stepped out into the rain. It was freezing, the water soaking through my clothes instantly. Mike got out on his side, keeping the knife pointed at me. "Walk," he said, nodding toward the trees. I started walking, my mind racing. The rain was so heavy I could barely see a few feet ahead. I had to find a way to escape, to get away from him. He was right behind me, the knife glinting in the dim light. We walked for what felt like hours, the mud sucking in my shoes, the rain relentless. My arm throbbed where he had cut me, and I was starting to feel dizzy. I had to do something, had to find a way to get away. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustling in the trees. I stopped, turning to look. Mike grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "Keep moving," he snapped. But the noise came again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps. I glanced around, trying to see through the rain. "Someone's coming," I said, hoping it was true. Mike looked around, his grip on my arm tightening. "Shut up," he hissed. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could see a light bobbing through the trees. Mike cursed, pulling me toward the car. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice panicked. I saw my chance. I twisted out of his grip and ran toward the light, screaming for help. "Help. Please help me." The light stopped, and I heard a voice call out. "Who's there?" Mike was right behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, the mud and rain slowing me down. I could hear him cursing, struggling to keep up. I burst through the trees and saw a figure holding a flashlight. It was a man, a hunter by the looks of it. "Help me," I cried, running toward him. He looked confused for a moment, then saw Mike coming after me. He raised the flashlight, shining it in Mike's face. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Mike stopped, the knife still in his hand. "Just a misunderstanding," he said, trying to sound calm. The hunter wasn't buying it. He raised his rifle, pointing it at Mike. "Drop the knife," he ordered. Mike hesitated, then dropped the knife in the mud. The hunter kept the rifle trained on him, his eyes narrowing. "You okay, miss?" he asked me. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you," I whispered. The hunter kept the rifle on Mike as he called the police. They arrived quickly, taking Mike into custody. I was safe, but I knew I would never forget that night, the terror and the rain. I would never pick up a hitchhiker again, not even for $1 million. It was pouring rain when I left the office that night. The storm had been building all day, and now it was a full-blown downpour. I hurried to my car, huddling under my umbrella, and saw Tom standing at the entrance. He looked soaked, even with his raincoat on. "Need a ride?" I called out. Tom smiled, relieved. "Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it." He climbed into the passenger seat, and I cranked up the heat. We chatted about work as I navigated the slick roads. The rain was so heavy, it was hard to see beyond a few feet. The wipers were working overtime, but it barely made a difference. We came to a red light, and I glanced over at Tom. He seemed tense, his fingers drumming on his knee. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't say anything. The light turned green, and I started to drive. A few blocks later, I noticed Tom wasn't in the car anymore. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard the door open or felt any movement. I pulled over, panic rising. How could he just disappear? I got out, looking around, calling his name. The rain was relentless, soaking me in seconds. There was no sign of him anywhere. I got back in the car, my mind racing. Did he jump out? Why didn't I hear anything? I decided to head back to the office, thinking maybe he had gone back there for some reason. When I arrived, the building was dark and locked up. I knocked on the door, hoping the night guard might have seen something. No answer. I was alone. I drove around the area, circling the blocks near where he vanished, but there was no sign of Tom. Feeling desperate, I called the police. They said they would send someone out to take a report, but their tone made it clear they thought he probably just decided to walk home. I sat in my car, shivering from the cold and the fear. Something was very wrong. I decided to go to Tom's apartment, hoping he might be there. When I got there, his lights were off. I banged on his door, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. I jumped, recognizing one of Tom's neighbors. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You looking for Tom?" he asked. I nodded. "Have you seen him?" He shook his head. "Not since this morning." "Is something wrong?" I explained what had happened, and he looked even more worried. "Tom's been acting strange lately. He mentioned something about being followed, but I thought he was just stressed from work." The rain kept pounding down as I got back into my car. My phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Rachel," a voice said. It was Tom, but he sounded scared. "Tom, where are you?" "I don't have much time." "Don't trust them," he whispered. The line went dead. My hands were shaking as I tried to call him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. I drove around aimlessly, trying to piece together what little I knew. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a black car that seemed to be following me. Every turn I made, it was right there behind me. Panic set in. I took a shark, turned down a side street, and sped up, hoping to lose them. My heart was pounding as I navigated the narrow, rain-slicked roads. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the car still behind me. I drove towards the outskirts of town, hoping the winding roads would help me shake them. The car was relentless, though, staying on my tail. I saw a narrow dirt road and turned onto it, the car bouncing over the rough terrain. The road led into a dense forest. The trees closed in around me, and the headlights of the car behind me disappeared. I kept driving until I found a small clearing, then turned off my engine and lights, hoping they wouldn't find me. I sat there in the dark, the rain hammering on the roof, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to figure out what was happening and why Tom had disappeared. I couldn't go home, it wasn't safe. After what felt like hours, the rain finally started to let up. I decided to head back to town, keeping to the back roads. I needed answers, and the only place I could think of was Tom's apartment. When I arrived, the building was dark and quiet. I snuck in through a side door that I knew was always left unlocked. I crept up to Tom's apartment and picked the lock, a skill I had learned years ago and never thought I'd need. Inside, the place was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and it looked like someone had been searching for something. I found Tom's laptop on the table and opened it, hoping for a clue. As I searched through his files, I found a folder marked Danger. Inside were documents and photos detailing some kind of conspiracy. There were pictures of people I recognized from around town, notes about meetings, and lists of names. It was all connected to some illegal activities that Tom had uncovered. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. I quickly closed the laptop and hid behind the couch. The door creaked open, and I saw a pair of boots step inside. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The person moved around the apartment, searching through the mess. After what felt like an eternity, they left, and I heard the door locked behind them. I waited a few minutes before coming out of my hiding spot. I grabbed Tom's laptop and slipped out of the apartment, heading back to my car. I needed to find a safe place to go through the files and figure out who I could trust. I drove to a nearby motel and checked in under a fake name. In the safety of my room, I opened the laptop again and went through everything. It was clear that Tom had stumbled onto something big, and now we were both targets. I knew I had to get this information to someone who could help, but I had to be careful. I spent the rest of the night making copies of the files and sending them to trusted contacts, hoping they would take it seriously. As dawn approached, I felt a little safer. The storm had passed, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I had to stay hidden until I could be sure the information was out and Tom was safe. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. I heard from one of my contacts that the information had been leaked to the press, and the authorities were investigating. Finally, I got a call from Tom. He was safe, hiding out in a different city. He thanked me for helping him, and we agreed to lay low until things blew over. It took months for the dust to settle, but eventually, the people behind the conspiracy were arrested, and things started to go back to normal. I never saw Tom again, but we kept in touch through encrypted messages. That rainy night changed everything. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to always be aware of my surroundings. Last month, I stayed at a small hotel while on a business trip. I was exhausted from the long day, and just wanted to relax. When I got to my room, there was a package outside my door. It was addressed to someone else, but the name on the label didn't match anyone I knew. I called the front desk and told them about the package. They said they would look into it, and just to leave it where it was for now. I didn't think much of it and went about my evening. Later that night, I decided to check the package out of curiosity. It was a plain brown box with no return address. I opened it, expecting to find something boring, but instead, there were documents inside. As I flipped through them, I realized they were filled with sensitive information, contracts, legal documents, and some handwritten notes that made no sense to me. The more I read, the clearer it became that these documents were important and potentially dangerous. I decided to take the package back to the front desk first thing in the morning. I put everything back in the box and set it aside. That night, I had trouble sleeping, uneasy about the contents of the package. The next morning, I went down to the lobby. The front desk was bustling with activity, but no one seemed to take notice of me at first. I finally got the attention of a young woman working there and explained the situation. She looked at the package and seemed puzzled. "I'll take care of it," she said, but her voice had a nervous edge. I went about my day, thinking little more of it. That evening, as I returned to the hotel, I noticed something odd. There was a man lingering near the entrance, looking around as if he was waiting for someone. I thought nothing of it and went inside. When I got to my room, I noticed a few missed calls on my phone. They were from an unknown number. I dismissed them and went to bed. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud knock on my door. My heart raced as I got out of bed and looked through the peephole. I saw the same man from earlier standing outside, his face hidden in the shadows. I didn't open the door. I quietly picked up my phone and called the front desk. No one answered. I was starting to panic. The knocking continued, louder and more insistent. I decided to call 911. As I was dialing, I heard a loud crash from the hallway, like something heavy being thrown. I hung up and ducked down behind the bed, hoping the intruder wouldn't hear me. I could hear footsteps approaching my door. They stopped right outside, and I held my breath, hoping they would just leave. The door handle rattled, but it didn't open. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded. I waited a few more minutes before daring to peek out. The hallway was quiet again. I quickly grabbed my things, went to the window, and climbed out onto the fire escape. It was raining heavily, and I was soaked in seconds, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I made my way down the fire escape, and as soon as I hit the ground, I ran to the nearest street and called a cab. I told the driver to take me to a nearby police station. I explained everything to the officers there, and they promised to look into it. They said it was good that I left the hotel. They had received reports of a possible threat to my safety. After everything, I never went back to that hotel, and I'm still not sure what was in those documents or why they were so important. I moved to a new place and stayed cautious. The whole ordeal made me realize how dangerous situations can escalate quickly, especially when dealing with things that don't seem right. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere. The road was empty, and my phone had no signal. I tried to restart the engine, but it just wouldn't turn over. I got out and looked under the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking at. It was just a mess of metal and wires to me. I was starting to panic when I saw headlights approaching. I waved my arms, hoping they would stop. The car slowed down and pulled over. A man rolled down his window and asked if I needed help. I told him my car wouldn't start and I needed a tow truck. He looked at my car and said he could give me a ride to the nearest town. I hesitated, but it was getting late and I didn't want to be stranded all night. I thanked him and got in. He seemed friendly enough, middle-aged, with a kind smile. We drove for a few minutes in silence. Then he started asking me questions. Where was I from? What was I doing out here? I answered politely, but something about his tone made me uneasy. He was too interested, too eager to know everything about me. I noticed we were heading in the opposite direction of the nearest town. I told him he was going the wrong way. He glanced at me and smiled, but didn't turn around. He said he knew a shortcut. My stomach twisted. Something was off. I asked him again to turn around, but he ignored me. I reached for my phone, hoping to find a signal, but there was none. He noticed and chuckled, saying it was pointless out here. My heart was pounding. I had to get out of this car. I told him to stop and let me out. He just kept driving, his smile gone now, replaced with a cold, hard look. I grabbed the door handle. It wouldn't open. Child locks. My panic rose. I was trapped. I started yelling at him, demanding he let me out. He laughed, a low, chilling sound. He said I wasn't going anywhere. I looked around the car, desperate for something to defend myself with. There was nothing. Just an old blanket on the back seat. We drove deeper into the woods, away from the main road. The trees closed in around us, blocking out the moonlight. It was dark, and I couldn't see a way out. He pulled the car over and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. He turned to me, his eyes cold and empty. He said I was going to do exactly what he said, or things would get ugly. I was shaking, my mind racing for a way out. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a knife. My blood ran cold. He ordered me to get out of the car. I hesitated, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't bluffing. I opened the door and stepped out, my legs trembling. He got up too, holding the knife casually, like it was just an extension of his hand. He told me to start walking. I asked where, but he just pointed deeper into the woods. I started walking, my mind frantically searching for a way to escape. The underbrush was thick, and the trees loomed overhead, blocking out the stars. I heard him walking behind me, his footsteps crunching on the leaves. I needed to do something, anything. I stumbled over a root and fell, and in that moment, I made a decision. I grabbed a handful of dirt and leaves and threw it in his face. He yelled, stumbling back, and I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as I could. Branches scratched my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, cursing and crashing through the underbrush. I saw a light ahead, a small cabin in the woods. I sprinted towards it, praying someone was home. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. The door opened, and an old man stood there, a shotgun in his hands. He took one look at me, and then passed me to the man chasing me. The old man raised his shotgun and fired a warning shot into the air. The man chasing me stopped, his face twisted in rage. He turned and fled back into the woods. The old man pulled me inside and locked the door. I collapsed on the floor, shaking and crying. He called the police, and they came and took my statement. They searched the woods, but didn't find the man. I was on a solo road trip, and decided to stay at a small hotel off the highway. It was late when I arrived, and the rain was coming down hard. The hotel was quiet and seemed decent enough, though it was a bit worn down. After checking in and getting to my room, I noticed an unmarked van parked outside the hotel. I thought it was strange, but I didn't pay it much attention. I was too tired and just wanted to relax. I ordered some takeout and spent the evening in my room. Around midnight, I went outside to get some fresh air. The rain had let up a little, and I noticed that the van was still there. It was parked right where I had seen it earlier, but now the headlights were on. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a coincidence. The next morning, I noticed the van again as I left the hotel to grab breakfast. It was parked across the street, and the same person seemed to be inside, watching me. It made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I had no reason to think someone was actually following me. After breakfast, I decided to head to a nearby park to clear my head. As I pulled out of the hotel parking lot, the van followed me. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the van stayed behind me the entire way. I could feel my anxiety rising, and by the time I reached the park, I was on edge. I parked and tried to take a walk to calm down, but the van parked a few spots away from me. The same person was still inside, staring straight ahead. My heart raced, and I decided it was time to go back to the hotel. I had to get out of there. When I returned to the hotel, I saw the van waiting outside the entrance. I felt trapped. I tried to go around the van to get into the hotel, but it moved to block my path. My pulse quickened as I realized something was seriously wrong. I went back to my car and tried to call the front desk from my phone. The line was dead. 2 years ago, when I was a sophomore in high school, I had started dating someone. I was around 15 to 16 years old through the entirety of this relationship. His name was Grayson. Our relationship was very explosive and toxic, but that's not what this story is primarily about. You see, Grayson's dad always gave me the creeps. I believe in a way he was a pathological liar. Here's some background. His name is Tim. Tim is really full of himself. He believes he's established his own businesses, thinks he's come up with innovative war tactics the government is using thanks to him. I also have reason to believe that he was dishonorably discharged from the military. Grayson always told me that he left the Air Force to come home and be with his wife. He doesn't have his uniform. He doesn't have any paperwork regarding this. However, leaving because your wife misses you isn't a valid excuse in the military. At first, it seemed innocent, such as giving me and my mom his cell phone number in case we ever needed to be in touch. Grayson was always bad about ignoring texts from his dad in school, so I'd find him and tell him that his dad was waiting outside for him, but it kinda got weird. He would go out of his way to text me and my mom for non-Grayson related matters. He would often invite me over when Grayson wasn't over to do things such as Grayson's laundry, or to bake cookies, or to even wait until he gets home to surprise him. My mom never let me, nor did I really want to go because I just knew this was weird. Anytime Grayson and I were on the phone, his dad would start saying really mean things to him, yelling at him, calling him stupid, etc. It always made me uncomfortable because I'd come around and his dad would act very differently. Every time Grayson and I were together, he'd start treating us like we were on playdates, like we were children. He would often remark about me being his stepdaughter to strangers, and this man could really talk. He would talk to anyone and everyone regardless if they seemed up to conversation or not, which made it really awkward for us because Grayson would have his arm wrapped around me and we'd be affectionate, and him saying that would just make things really awkward for us. I remember trying to tell Grayson several times that his dad just really freaked me out, and that my parents weren't happy about his dad either. He didn't really understand. He told me that he had lost his daughter at birth, and that maybe him acting this way was kind of his way of coping with it. Grayson's dad, Tim, had recently gotten close with a neighbor at the apartment complex. She also had a daughter. Kelly was 6, maybe even 7 years old. Her mom was a complete deadbeat. She would only come around Tim whenever she needed money to get cigarettes or drugs, but she did not hesitate to let Kelly spend several hours alone with Tim, or letting Tim pick her up from school. I remember one specific time that he brought Kelly along to pick Grayson up from my house. It was cold outside. He sent her to my door wearing PJs. We had been watching a scary movie, and when she saw Grayson, she then excitedly said, "Tim is taking me to see Moana." It was 11 p.m. It was really late, and I was extremely bewildered. Kelly eventually got taken away from her mother, and she was placed in a foster home. Tim would try to get me or Grayson to go to the door and leave stuff for her to have from Tim. Then he eventually even tried to get custody of her, regardless that there was no blood relation or any credentials that would allow him to do so. Another time around the Super Bowl, he had come up to the door with a beer bottle in hand. He doesn't even ask to come in. He just kind of forces open the door and then comes in the bathroom to pee. He then takes Grayson, beer bottle in hand, and drives home. Here's a list of other things that I remember happening, but it's been over a few years, so there's more, but I can't recall every detail. One time Tim texted my mom and inquired about me and Grayson. We had been arguing, and we had argued a lot. His dad then jokingly asks my mom, "Is she on her period?" I get it, it's a crude joke, and that many guys joke about it, but imagine someone texting you and asking on your daughter's behalf. Another time, Grayson and I were giggling and making jokes in the back seat. I remember his dad always talking about me and Grayson getting married. I was a sophomore, he was a freshman, so we thought about it. Yeah, but was it ideally going to happen? Not really. Grayson then says something along the lines of, "Getting married?" I don't think so. His dad then says, "Well, if you don't marry her, then I will." I was honestly shocked that something like that would even be said. I was at that point very weirded out. He had asked me to go out to Golden Corral with him and Grayson. I knew Grayson was at his mom's house, but for some reason, I thought he had already came home and was with his dad. I got into his dad's car. I was just in the car with him and two other older men. I started furiously texting Grayson. I asked him where he was and if he was actually going. He was asleep. He didn't even know his dad had come and got me. His mom was totally pissed. She chewed his dad out on the phone while I was on the car speaker, and I was sitting behind a seat. She said that I needed to stop with this weird behavior. We go inside the restaurant, and I'm quiet. I'm just waiting for Grayson to text me back. I'm upset and confused. He finally comes in. He was mortified. I wanted so badly to go home, but I didn't want to make a scene by leaving, so I just tolerated it. Our last and final argument ensued. It was because Grayson started sexting other girls. Grayson made it very clear that he did not permit me to talk to other boys. I unadded every boy on social media, so this really distraught me after everything that our relationship went through. There were other signs that I ignored too, about how he'd surround himself with girls whenever I wasn't around, and how he'd touch on other girls in gym class. But this was the final and last time that I wanted to be walked all over. I snitched on him to his dad. I didn't explicitly say that Grayson had sexed girls. I didn't want him to be in any legal trouble, but I did ask him to delete my number, and I told him that I wouldn't be coming around anymore. His dad told me that I was being unreasonable, and that his son was a gentleman, and that he raised his son well enough that his son would never cheat. It was a lot more drama than I needed, so at the end of it all, I blocked him on everything. Tim started trying to reach out to me through his Facebook account, through his business account. I often just blocked him and didn't tell my mom because I felt like it was old news. A few months ago, I reached out to Grayson. Grayson had taken my virginity. I was really embarrassed to tell him that I had an STI and that he needed to be checked. A week or two later, I got a letter in the mail. His dad, Tim, decided to reach out to me. Keep in mind, me and Grayson had only talked about the STI stuff, nothing more. We had been apart for 2 years. I still lived at the same address. I suppose he had told his dad that he needed to get testing done, and that his dad took it upon himself to discipline me, now 18 years old. I'll retype a few of the things he said on this card. The front of the card says, "Which first? Pout or cry?" with a little girl and pigtails on the front pouting. Opening the card, it originally just says, "Miss you," and then written all over the card, "You're too smart for irresponsible behavior. Respect yourself. Respect your body. Reach for the stars. Achieve your goals. Get your education. Don't blow it now. Hang on, baby girl. If you need me, just call me. If you need a ride or just someone to talk to, your friend Tim. Picture your future. Achieve your dreams. Hey dear, respect yourself. Don't throw yourself at boys. If a guy truly loves you, he'll hold on to you. There's so many diseases out there. Some are incurable. Reserve sex for marriage and do right by God. Don't become a mama. You're very smart, pretty, nice, and sincere. Don't let this world change you. I wasn't the one to even open the card. My mom was, as she had recognized the name. She called the cops and had them investigate it further. Even the cops remarked that this behavior was strange and should be looked into. I don't really know all of the details. I was working when all of this went down. We still have the card in my mom's nightstand as evidence, just in case this were to go any further. His older brother Tyler works at a bar-type restaurant we frequent a lot. He and I don't really make small talk. We act like we don't know each other, but by the way he looks at me, I can tell in a way that he feels sorry. I truly empathize with him because he too has had a long-term girlfriend, and I can only imagine his dad doing the same thing to them. It's gotten so bad that one of his older sons who has his first grandbabies is moving away just to get away from him. His wife doesn't like Tim, and even he can see through the man that his dad proclaims to be. I apologize if this is all scattered and doesn't really add up. It's been a while, and I haven't really typed it all out, nor really talked to anyone about this other than my immediate family. I have other reasons to believe that maybe Tim isn't mentally sound, and he uses religion to back up his reasoning for many things that he does wrong in his life. I think maybe the reason why our relationship failed was because Grayson's dad mistreated him, and going to his mom's house was an escape from that. I think that is truly why Grayson treated me how he did, and it really breaks my heart for him. But I am glad that I'm well out of that relationship, well out of having to deal with his dad, and in a brand new relationship with a family that adores me. While this isn't extreme, I really hope that I'll never be involved with Tim or affiliate with any of the members of his family again. Update. I've had some questions regarding the whole STI thing, so to clear things up I'll say it here. I did have a sex life after Grayson without being in any other relationships. I didn't have my first appointment until a while after. My STI was asymptomatic, so therefore I didn't realize anything was wrong. I don't know if Grayson gave it to me or what. I don't know how long I had it afterwards. I don't know when I got it. I just know I had it. My OBGYN asked me to notify anyone I was involved with, and everyone who I was with were told, going back to Grayson as he was the first guy I'd ever been with. I'm going to start this with some context, so this makes a little more sense. So the place where I live is like a mini New York City. Our crime rate is actually higher than New York City, if that doesn't tell you anything. There are crackheads, gang members, and just all-around people that you don't want to encounter, especially at night. The story happened when I was 18, and I had a friend that I'd known for years that stupidly was in a gang because of his family's past. This is going to be important later. I was hanging out with said friend, which I'll call Alex due to privacy on their behalf. We lived in a city where the biggest things we had around us were food chains, so there was really never much to do. We decided that we were going to walk around a little bit, and then eventually go to one of our main hangout spots to go smoke a little and just generally hang out. It was about 2:45 a.m. when we were starting to walk, so by the time we got closer to our spot we were trying to reach, the church bell in our town rang to signify that it was 3 a.m. Alex and I were joking about how creepy it was and wondering why it would go off at such a late hour. I had a soda with me that I just opened before we left, so I chugged it and just held on to it since we didn't have any trash cans near us. Fast forward a little bit, and we were finally reaching our hangout spot. Now the spot was the corner of a parking lot, but it was up on a hill so the edges were stone walls so no one would fall off. The drop was about a story high. We noticed an abandoned baby carriage as we were walking to the corner. I ended up getting freaked out and was jumping out of nowhere. I acted like something big was trapped behind us, causing me to snap my whole body around, which really freaked out my friend and made him look too. Mind you, there wasn't any noise or vibration from anything falling. Nothing had actually fallen, I just randomly felt like it had happened. That's when we spotted someone walking around in the parking lot. I immediately knew something was wrong, but my friend was just trying to get me to walk over to the corner so they wouldn't notice us. As soon as we made it to the corner, they started rushing towards us. I don't know why neither of us decided to just walk away at that point, but looking back at it, we were already trapped in a bad situation as soon as they saw us. As soon as the guy reached us, he had started asking us, "Did you guys leave all this trash here?" Talking about the baby carriage and various other things that were around it. Both Alex and I were confused but just denied it, saying we just got here and we had no clue where any of it came from. The guy didn't believe us and kinda was eyeing us up and down. That's when we noticed he was in layers and layers of clothing, like 2 different pairs of pants with shorts over the top and a long-sleeved shirt with multiple other short-sleeved shirts over the top of it. He also had a backpack and different clothes draped over his arm, but it wasn't cold outside since it was July. That's when he mentioned the trash again. "Are you guys sure this wasn't you?" Pointing at the carriage. Again, we denied being any part of it. That's when he let it go. We just stood in silence for a couple of seconds. Then he started again. "What are you guys doing out here? Are you smoking some weed?" He asked us with a grin. We said no, we don't do any drugs at all. He gave a suspicious look and then just asked us why we were there. Alex spoke up and told him that we were just there to look at the stars and hang out for a little bit. This is where it got even weirder. The guy had started talking about how he has his own fashion line and that he was a well-known guy, telling us how lucky we were to even be able to look at him. That's when he started showing off the little silver chains that he had on his neck and wrist. We could obviously tell that he wasn't all there and was on something. So to not piss him off, we said that we've seen some of his stuff online and that it was really cool to meet him. He lit up. He started talking about how he had some exclusive stuff coming out soon, and that he was going to give us early access to it. That's when he lifted up the clothes that were in his hand. It was this big oversized pair of shorts that were from the dollar store. This dude just started shoving them towards us saying, "Here, smell it. It's my new cologne that I just made." He put it in Alex's face. My friend just stared at him down while leaning towards the shorts, pretending to sniff them. The guy then shoved them towards me, and I got a full face of lemon scent, like cleaner. I just kind of smiled and said that it smelled nice while silently freaking out, thinking I was just drugged and had chloroform in my face. "Here, you guys have this. It's on the house," he said with a smile as he handed them to me. I didn't know what to do, so I just held them up and glanced over them with a smile, saying thank you as I draped them over my arm. That's when he asked how old we were. "I'm 17. I said, not wanting him to know that I was no longer a minor in our state. That's when Alex's demeanor changed, and he just stood there glaring at the man without a word. The man laughed a little bit at it, then started talking about this random book, telling us how it's God's word, and how this book opened his eyes and changed his life. He opened the book and started showing my friend different pages in the book. At this point, my friend wasn't saying a single word or moving, just watching him. So not to send the guy any red flags, I just kind of nodded along trying to be nice and calm as my anxiety was steadily rising. He handed my friend the book and told him to keep it and to let it change his life. That's when he then stepped back for a second to adjust his pants. He then started pointing around us, saying that he had connections and people watching us at that moment. I could barely hold my act as he was saying all this. Alex grabbed his phone out showing the time, that it was 3:30 a.m. Alex then finally spoke. "I'm sorry, but we gotta go, man. My mom is texting me that we need to get home." His parents were asleep and had no clue we were out. The guy just kind of stared at him a bit freaked out, then asked him, "Your mom is calling you?" And Alex just replied that she texted him telling him to get home now that she was looking for us. The guy just kind of nodded and said he would see us later then. As we were walking away, he stopped us and said that he almost forgot to give us one last gift. He pulled out one of those capsules that you get from the quarter machines in the grocery store, and it was 3 big versions of those tiny colored bone candies. He handed the capsule to me and said it was a gift from the blog party. In my city, we have something called a blog party where the main streets of the town are blocked off, so the city can throw a little rave with music and vendors all around, which had just happened a day or two prior. I just smiled and said thank you. Then Alex and I started walking the opposite way. The street we took to get up there was on our left, but we didn't want to lead him back to one of our houses, so we took a little side street that would lead us to the main road, but he would still be able to see us until we were able to turn the corner at the end of it. As we started walking that way, and the guy was walking back to the middle of the parking lot where he originally was, Alex leaned towards me and then said in a whisper, "Don't freak out, but he has a gun." I immediately felt my heart drop and the anxiety settle into my chest. Alex just kept repeating, "He has a gun, don't freak out, I'll get you out of here, you're with me. I got you, he has a freaking gun, dude." I quickly asked, "Where are we going?" "Straight, just keep going straight," Alex said. So we quickly kept walking straight, and once we popped out at the end of the side road, we just kept walking straight, so he didn't know which direction we were going. We didn't turn around the whole time in fear that he was following us or watching us. Alex then whispered, "As soon as I tell you we're going to run, okay?" I just replied with, "Can we get rid of this?" Talking about the crap that he had handed us. Alex just said, "Not yet, they'll find it on the ground and try and find us." As soon as we were out of sight, he said to run, so we started booking it down the street. I kept telling him that we needed to get out of his line of sight, because if we kept running the way we were, he'd be able to see us from far away, because the road we were headed towards had a clearing letting you see all the way back to the parking lot. We ended up running through an alleyway onto another street, but my friend kept almost leading us towards the clearing again, so I pushed him towards another alleyway to try and get away from that guy's line of sight. We were by a parking garage that had paid access when Alex and I finally slowed down for a few seconds. "Here, walk through the garage. If anything happens, it'll be on camera." I just asked again, "When are we going to get rid of this crap?" "In a minute," he replied. "I'll let you know when to drop it, but as soon as we do, we need to run." He started looking around, checking to see if the man was following us, as we were then fast walking through the parking lot. Once we got to the exit of the garage, he looked around outside and quickly said, "All right, drop and run." We both threw the things down outside of the exit and started running. When I dropped the things that I had in my hand, I had also dropped the empty can, which made a ting noise when it hit the ground, causing us to bolt, scared that he had heard it. As we were running, I kept throwing up the soda that I had chugged in front of me, but I never stopped. Alex tried stopping me for a second to check on me, but I kept pushing him forward, saying that we needed to get the hell out of here. Once we finally reached near our houses, he told me to come back with him, because he didn't think it was a good idea of leaving me alone at my house, since it was just me and one other person who lived in my house. We didn't stop running until we got inside his house. We just sat there in silence for a bit. Alex then finally broke his silence. "Do you know anything he was talking about?" he asked. "Other than the fact that he said he had people watching us, no." Alex shook his head and replied with, "I do. He was trying to recruit us in his gang. He was trying to teach us old Italian mafia terms. That was what he was showing me in the book. He mentioned a couple of big drug lords that I don't even want to talk about. That's why he handed you the capsule and told you where his people were, so we'd drop it off to them to do a drug deal. He's the one who put the baby stroller there. It's an old trick to make people go and check to make sure there isn't a baby in it, so he could trap us. Especially with it being at the corner of a drop." I just didn't know what to say. All I could think was how I felt in danger the second we made it to the top of the hill. "How did you know he had a gun?" I asked. When he stepped back to adjust his pants, he grabbed onto it to move it. I saw it shining in the light. After that, I didn't really want to walk outside in fear that I'd run into him again. The next day, me and my other friend had to go to the store, and the garage that we had thrown all the stuff outside of just so happened to be on the way to the store. When we drove by, I noticed that everything was missing. I just hoped that the owners of the building just threw it all away. I haven't been back to that spot to this day, and I kid you not, every time I see a baby carriage, I just avoid it like the plague. I also get freaked out every time I hear that same church bell ring, making me think it's a warning that something bad is about to happen. I found out a year later that my now boyfriend was a security guard at the block party that same year. His team ended up actually kicking that guy out of the party because he was harassing people and selling drugs to local crackheads at the event. So to anyone who ever finds a stroller abandoned or just has an uneasy feeling, leave the area immediately. Be safe out there, everyone. When I was in middle school, I was a petite and an attractive lady with curves with daddy issues. So I signed up for some hookup dating apps to meet with random local guys. Dangerous and illegal, I know, but I was a stupid middle schooler who was having untreated mental issues. There was this one guy I matched up with, I'll call Tyler. I was meeting up with Tyler in the dead of night, so he could drive me to his place so he could hook up. The reason why I was so late at night around 3 in the morning was because I had to sneak out, and over time I had memorized my parents' sleeping patterns since they didn't have an exact schedule. Anyways, I was sneaking out through the front door, and I had to wait for Tyler to drive to the location. I sent him to the park and then wait for me. To walk there, you just have to cross the townhomes I live in at the time to a local elderly's home that where I live is known as a place to meet up as friends or couples. As I was walking across, there was an area which I had to go through to get to the elderly's home, and it was dark as hell. There's a sidewalk gap between apartments so people could walk their dogs and stuff, which looks totally normal in the morning, but terrifying at night. I was walking up the stairs that lead into this section of the sidewalk, and I had a dreading feeling that someone was watching me. I froze in my tracks with my heart racing before I decided to continue walking forward, since Tyler was picking me up soon, and a silhouette of a tall, big, dark figure emerged from the shadows and then approached me. Some of the light of the surrounding porch lights had lit up his features. It was a man who was about 5 feet 11 inches to 6 foot tall, and he was a big Hispanic guy with some facial hair who looked to be above the age of 20, who just kind of looked like he wasn't all there. He walked a bit closer, and I was too stunned to walk away as he then began to speak with slurred speech. "Hey, are you looking for Chloe's house?" I then responded with a confused no. "Are you Chloe?" I said no, and then I asked who she was. He proceeded to tell me that she was having a house party, and he's waiting for everyone to leave, so they can have some alone time or something like that. It was really hard to tell since he was obviously on something at the moment. He then asked for my name, and of course, as the dumbass I told him my actual name. He said that it was pretty, and then he told me to hold up before he turned on his phone flashlight, then saying, "Damn, you're fine as hell." I quickly shot him down and told him that I was only 14, and he didn't seem to believe me. At some point in the conversation, he kept suggesting that we should hang out, but at this point I was just trying to escape, but every time I tried he kept blocking the way out. He had asked me some questions and almost asked for my number, but I decided to sort of cut him off before telling him that I really had to go because someone was waiting for me. I didn't know if Tyler was there yet or not, but it made a good excuse before I bolted the hell out of there and kindly worded it before I left. and then started to sprint to the other side of the street. He wasn't there yet, though, so I waited a bit longer on the sidewalk. Another stranger who I assumed was from the same party was walking by and asked if I was all right. We made some small talk, which made me feel better. Just then I finally saw Tyler's car. He arrived. Nothing else creepy happened that night, thank God, and he didn't live in my town. He was just there for the house party, or at least I hope. I know that he asked me some other weird and creepy things, but I'm having a hard time remembering since it's late at night. But this experience really scared the hell out of me since I was obviously a minor, and also just approaching a woman at night and blocking their access out. Who does that? I wonder what could have happened if I didn't tell him that someone was waiting for me, or if he wasn't waiting for some chick who he drove an entire town over to bang at 4 in the morning. Please be careful and don't do what I did at all. The story happened slightly over 20 years ago when I was 16. During this time I lived with my mom and stepdad in a remote area 70 miles west of Las Vegas, Nevada. I'd gone out to visit with my friends, being allowed to drive myself for the first time ever. I had a lovely time watching a movie and getting food together until it was time for me to head home. The curfew I was given was 10 p.m. with the caveat that if I was running late for any reason to find a payphone and call. Then I wrapped around me in my old 71 Chevy pickup, as there were no streetlights or houses for most of the way home. As I pulled up to the first of 2 stop sites, I could see an older sedan. Old cars are still pretty common in that area. The car was stopped with its hazards on. I pulled up behind it and waited as a man in his 30s to 40s started walking towards me from the driver's side. Even at this point, I didn't have any alarm bells going off in my head yet. Being in the middle of the Mojave Desert, providing assistance to stranded people was common. People rapidly get into severe problems there by not having enough water when a vehicle breaks down, or not realizing that it's a freaking desert, and people die wandering delirious away from the highway trying to find help. Anyhow, I rolled down my window as he came up to my door, and I could smell the liquor on him. I could see another man in the passenger seat. This was before anyone I knew had cell phones, and the nearest payphone was a good 10 minutes drive ahead. I didn't have a way to call the cops on a drunk driver immediately. The man then explained that his car stalled, and he asked if I could help them out. I asked if his car was a stick shift, which it was, so I asked if he was familiar with push starting it. He said yes, so I agreed to as gently as I could push their car with my truck while they turned the engine over. For anyone that isn't familiar, this is a way to start a manual car that's having battery or starter issues specifically to get it somewhere to work on it. I knew that my truck would be fine, and I didn't feel like it would be wise to get out and try to push their car physically. Push starting their car worked without a hitch, but here's where things go south. They get back out and thank me, then invite me to hang out and have some fun with them. I decline. They pull off to the side of the road, and I continue on my way, only they start following me. So here I am. It's 9:50, and I'm running late because I stopped to help them. Admittedly, I hadn't given myself much leeway from leaving my friends. These drunk, creepy older guys have started to follow me on the road without any man-made light except for car headlights, and I'm at least 10 minutes away from a payphone. I think to myself, maybe I'm being paranoid. So I turn down a road that I know gave me a couple of turn-offs to either head back to town or loop around the gas station with a payphone. The car follows behind me. I'm thinking, damn. I take another turn that only leaves a couple of houses at the end of the road, and they turn behind me. I take another turn to loop around back to the gas station, and they follow me again. So at least I know they're following me, and not just heading home. At this point, my heart is pounding. I decided to try something to lose them. I pull off to the side of the road, and I see them pull up behind me. I wait as the driver gets out of the car and begins to walk towards me. His companion also gets out and starts walking towards me. I wait until they almost get to my tailgate, then floor it. My wheels dig into the rocks and poof, dirt causing a cloud behind me. I then head towards the gas station. The gas station is deserted, but the payphone is showered in the light from the gas pumps. I call home and explain what happened and why I was running late. My stepdad asked me if the gas station worker could be seen, but I let him know that I couldn't see him behind the counter, that he was probably in the back. I wasn't in trouble, but I was asked to hurry home. So to the 2 drunk idiots that were messing with me that night, I have no idea what you had planned, but you should really be ashamed of yourselves for trying to pull that on a 16-year-old kid. This happened to me about a week ago. I found a summer job at our local supermarket, and about 2 weeks in, I got asked to work the late night shift, which was 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. I accepted it since I was really in need of money, and I never really sleep early anyways. Everything was fine and dandy until about 3 a.m. when a shirtless, scarred-up guy came in the store. After lingering around in the store for a while, he quickly came up to the counter, making intense eye contact with me. As I was about to ask him if he needed any help, he then whispered, "Hey, don't you dare move." I didn't hear him at first, so I asked him if he could repeat that. At that point, he got agitated and then yelled, "Make another sound or I'll cut you up." In a swift emotion, he vaulted over the counter going to the alcohol section, trying to grab a bottle of whiskey. Thankfully, the owner had hid a baseball bat under the counter. The moment he turned his back to me, I took the bat and then swung full force at his knee. He winced in pain and tried to get up. I winded my bat yet again, acting like I was going to hit him again, just to see him pull out a homemade shiv of some sort. I let him get up, and at the moment he got up, he swung his shiv right at me, lightly lacerating my wrist. I pushed him back with my bat, and he ran for the door and got out. The day after I had called the cops and showed them the security camera footage, but they haven't contacted me since. I think it's safe to say I won't be working the late night shift again for a long time. I often like to go out running in the summer, or really whenever the weather's nice. This happened a week before I was supposed to start high school. I thought about going running that day, but got the idea in the morning that I would run in the evening, instead while the sun is still up but isn't as hot as in the day, and there isn't a chance for it to get hotter if I don't manage to get back in time like in the morning. Well, of course, I forget my promise to myself, and only remember it at around 9 p.m. Now it's the end of the summer, so the sun is already setting sooner than I'm used to, but I just tell myself, I'll just get back inside like an hour or so. It'll be fine. I've already been putting off running, so I don't want to put it off again. I should probably mention that I'm a girl, and even though a lot of girls I know change the side of the road they walk on whenever they see a distinctly drunk-looking guy walking, I was always the one calling them pussies, and was ready to take on the first rogue who tried to get to me. I also live in a less populated area out of the town, where almost everyone knows everyone, so I was feeling extra sure of my safety. What a naive fool I was, I know. So I go out, start my run, and it's fine. It's getting a bit dark, but I can still see the running track, so it's all good. I start to feel a bit off when I see a pair walking in front of me. When I get closer, they turn out to be just teenage guys, and I run past them with no problem. When I finally reach the usual spot in my run where I turn around, a cemetery. Ultra creepy, I know, but it has benches and it's a small graveyard, so I never feel weird taking a break there, and it's already gotten pretty dark. I drink some water from my bottle and just stand under a tree next to the gate and territory of the cemetery. But I don't sit down where I usually do because the bench is next to a fence, and the darkness has finally made me a little weary about being alone and someone jumping on me. It's pretty funny that that's what scared me the most at the time. When I catch my breath, I stay for a few more minutes just listening to the wind. I see a bike drive past the cemetery taking the route that I'll take while running back. I leave my resting place, and it's gotten really dark. Dark enough that I could barely see 2 meters in front of me. I start slowly running back. After 15 meters or so, I start hearing voices. A couple of more, and I can clearly hear someone talking. My thoughts immediately jump to a conclusion that there are at least 2 people in front of me if I'm hearing a conversation. Now I slow down even more until I get close enough to actually hear what's being said. Keep in mind it's completely dark, and this road doesn't even have street lights, so I can't see anything. I get close enough to finally make out the words, and my heart sinks at what I hear. I can't recall the exact words that were being said, but the general idea. The male voice then said, "I see this girl. I could just pull her into the bushes." There were tall bushes lining one side of the running track. As I said, at first my heart stopped, but immediately after I go into fight or flight mode. I can hear my own heart beating in my ears, and I'm full of adrenaline. The bad kind. I know that I can't just stop, or he'll know that I heard what he said, so I continue to walk, but thank God that the running track is separated from the road by a small grass field, so I go to the side of the road making some distance between us. I kept looking at him. Keep in mind I still don't even know how many people there are, but I see a square of light, presumably a phone, and then I hear him jump on his bicycle and drive off. It turned out he was talking on the phone, but just because he was alone didn't mean I was any less scared of him. I walked on the side of the road for a good few minutes until I'm sure he would be far away from me, and once I get back on the running track, I then sprint home like crazy. All the way back I was shaking with fear and looking at the bushes and cars that passed me with delirium, squishing my water bottle in my hand, ready to smack anyone who came close to me. When I finally reached the first road lights, I really felt like I escaped death. I really got lucky that night. So this first started when I first moved into my new place last summer in 2019. I live with my landlord, her elderly mom, and my friend Daisy. I also started a new job working the night shift at a hotel, so I was up most nights. I'm going to preface the story with some background information that would help make the story make sense. Since my landlord knew her neighbors very well as she lived in this house all her life, and there's hardly any street parking, I was able to park my car in the vacant house's driveway, directly parallel across the street from our house. When I park my car, I can see the front of my place with my rear view mirrors. Our house is right in front of a very busy stop sign, so seeing and hearing traffic is something that we all had to get used to. Daisy and I are women, and are best friends that met in college. We've known each other for a few years at this point, and did everything together. I remember that it was a warm summer Thursday night. Daisy and I loved to leave the house past midnight, eat horrible fast food, roll the windows down, and drive along the coast. It was around 1:45 a.m. as I finally pulled up to my parking spot. We sat in my car for a while listening to music and finishing the last bit of our late-night munchies. My windows were up by this point, but we could hear a bigger car approaching the stop sign. It sounded like a diesel. Of course, it was a stereotypical white van that prompted me to joke, "Daisy, look at that creepy white van." From my rearview mirror, the next thing we knew, we saw what looked like a thin man pick up his camera from the passenger side and take at least 5 pictures of the front of our house with the flash on it. Daisy and I silently looked at each other in horror as the van then sped off. The next day, Daisy and I told our landlord all about the incident, and she told us this wasn't the first time that one of her tenants reported this. Though she brushed it off despite us telling her that anyone taking pictures of her house that late at night did not have good intentions, it really put Daisy and me on edge. Some time had passed as the coronavirus pandemic crept its way into the U.S. towards the end of 2019. I was going to file a police report as I eventually got most of the person's license plate after what felt like a month of investigating. At the beginning of February 2020, the van stopped coming. This caused me to think that the pandemic may have either gotten the person sick or affected them in some way. Although the person didn't take any more pictures, when the van drove by it came from the same direction, every time at around 1 to 1:30 a.m. It would stop for an eerily long amount of time, then it would speed off out of nowhere, as if the person was racing another car that was never there. I did stop investigating after 2 weeks of nothing. I still get very anxious if I ever hear a loud diesel-like vehicle driving by late at night. I don't know what that person wanted, why they were taking pictures of my landlord's house. Maybe once the shelter in place is lifted in my county, I might investigate again, just to ensure that the creep is really gone. We were 16, an age where you feel invincible. It was summer and school was out, and my friend and I, who lived in the same apartment complex, decided to go to the mall and kill time, as any other teenager would do. I don't remember much about that day other than our walk home from the mall. It must have been around 9 when we left, since that's the time the mall closes. Our apartment building was 2 miles away from the mall, so of course we walked. It was really hot out, and we both knew that once we got home there would be nothing to do, so we opted to walk home. We both enjoyed the conversation and the passing of time. Our town wasn't exactly dangerous. Yeah, there were some muggings and theft, but it wasn't as bad as some of the other cities in our county, so we walked those 2 miles oblivious to any potential threats. We were a mile in when we had passed an intersection. Shortly thereafter, 3 males walked out of the opposite street and began walking behind us. I didn't think much of it. It's summer. They were young. It's hot. No reason to be suspicious. My friend, however, was unnerved. "Hey, yeah, those guys are behind us." "Yeah, what about them?" "Well, I'm pretty sure they're following us." My friend said, "What?" "No, I don't think so. You're just being paranoid." As soon as I said that, one of the men started whistling at us. I turned around. "Hey, what you got in the bag?" We had shopping bags from the mall. "Nothing. Leave us the hell alone," my friend retorted. I remember just being pissed. Why would she respond to them? At this point, I'm nervous as hell. Turns out my friend was right. Call it intuition. We begin walking even faster now that we sense danger, and as we quicken our pace, so do the men. They know we're onto them. We near a plaza with a Del Taco, and as we enter the parking lot, the men disperse. One is directly behind us, and the other 2 were on our sides. I turn around. They all then whip out freaking baseball bats out of nowhere. At this point, I turn to my friend, and we hightail it to Del Taco, not bothering to turn around. Thank God it wasn't too late, or they'd be closed, and we'd have nowhere to hide. As soon as we enter the Del Taco, we look out the windows and witness all of the men jump into a Cadillac Escalade that was parked. Were they only scaring us? Why the bats? Why the car? What the hell's going on? We just watch as the car drove away. That doesn't quell our fear, though. We spend about 10 minutes in the restaurant deciding what to do next. Do I call my dad to pick us up, or do we actually walk the half a mile home? We didn't want to worry our parents, and so we ended up deciding to walk. The whole time, we're constantly turning back, anticipating a black Escalade to pop out of nowhere and kidnap us, but luckily it never did. As soon as we got home, we promised ourselves not to tell our parents, as we knew it would hinder us from hanging out again. The moment I walked through the door, I blabbed to my parents. I found out later that my friend did the same.